Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out this morning. We really appreciate you being here. We're really excited to have this conversation. And with the audience, with people in community, with people from campus, with students, with whatever capacity we operate in, nonprofits, legal system, whatever. It's really important for us to really bring different groups of people together to have dialogues and to really get underneath of the critical social justice and ethical issues that face us today. I'm Rhonda Williams. I'm the founder and director of the Social Justice Institute here at Case Western Reserve University. This event is co-sponsored, Human Trafficking ? And we put a question mark after the title for a reason, right? To both talk about it as something that's happening in the world, to talk about it in relationship with other kinds of exploitation that are happening in the world in relationship to labor or what we perceive as trafficking or other modalities of exploitation. And we kind of really want to get underneath of that and to really have us question and engage in the conversation together. So we're going to have presenters. We also want to make sure we have a real rich Q&A as part of this conversation as well. This is co-sponsored by the Social Justice Institute and the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence. And I want to start by doing some thanks. I want to thank the planning team, which really pulled together and brought this event to bear, to fruition, to really, I kind of think, a rich state of conversation. We had a lot of dialogue in the planning team itself about what this would be, what it would look like, what are the questions we would try to engage. Brian Gran is the chair of the planning team, and I want to especially thank him. It was out of a conversation that we had and some of his work and some of the things that we thought were pressing issues both locally and globally that we said, okay, maybe this could be an actual event for our UN World Social Justice Day. And that's what this event is in some ways marking, UN World Social Justice Day. It happens every year in February, has been happening since 2007, really focusing on social and economic issues, injustices, questions around development and access, power dynamics, all of those things within an international lens. So we thought it would be good not only to do this topic because of the international lens, but because of the ways in which it can be brought here home to really have the conversation about the relationship between the international and the local. So I want to thank Brian Gran, the planning team, Mano Singham, John Flores, Misty Lumine, who actually was supposed to be one of our panelists, but has pneumonia. So she will not be able to join us, but sends her regrets and hopes for a good discussion and dialogue. Shannon French, Naomi Sig, myself, and Jove C., who's not, I don't see him right now, but he's an undergraduate here at the university who helped us with this event. I want to thank security for the campus. I don't think any of them are here, but they opened the building this morning at 7 a.m. so we could come in and rearrange everything quickly and get things set up. I want to thank Davey, who's in the back with Media Vision, who is actually taping the event. When we have the question and answer period, there will be a microphone that will come around to you. Wait till it gets to you so that we can actually get your question. People can hear it. The panelists actually have these tabletop microphones are working as long as the red light is on. So I'm mixing up the greetings and logistics and the thanks all at the same time. So when I sit down, I'm down. I want to thank the staff that gave us great support on this. Susan Vadino, Shelley White, Loretta Lafitte Griffin, and Kimberly Rocket. Is that how you say her last name? Rocket from the sociology department, who also helped us with this event. So really we saw this event as a way to accent and explore and question and grapple with human trafficking, to really begin to have a conversation about the different and related forms of labor exploitation, and to really begin to think about and address and consider injustices and ethics issues that relates to this topic, and begin to think about not only how we intervene in the moment, which is important, the immediate kinds of things we can do, but what the long struggle is that we have to engage in if we're going to get to the root causes underneath of what is driving some of the dynamics related to labor exploitation and human trafficking. And so with that as the framework, I want to turn it over to Brian. I want to ask Brian to come up. He's going to introduce the first session to you, and then we'll get started. How about that? So thank you very much for being here, and eat up.
Professor Williams. Good morning. Thanks for coming, especially on an early day and a beautiful day at that. Our panel this morning is about modalities of exploitation. Our first speaker is Professor John Flores of Case Western's History Department. Our second speaker is Dr. Rachel Lovell of the Mandel School, and in particular the Begin Center, and she will talk about methodologies and issues about studying exploitation and trafficking. And then third, we have Ms. Carol Skutnik, who is an assistant U.S. attorney who handles cases, prosecutes cases in these areas. So, thank you.
Thanks.
Should we clap so that... We like affirmation, too.
You want me to dim?
You want to dim the lights?
Yeah, we dim these at least? Thanks.
Is that going to...
That's good.
Okay. So, at present, the United Nations estimates that more than 200 million people have migrated across international borders in search of employment. The unemployment and extreme poverty that force people to migrate, and the nation states that criminalize labor migration, leave working people vulnerable to super exploitation and human trafficking. Here in the United States, there are an estimated 12 to 13 million undocumented Mexican migrants, many of whom live in fear of deportation and often work for poverty wages. Commentators in the United States frequently discuss Mexican migration as a product of the poverty and political instability found in Mexico. Far too often, these discussions fail to incorporate the role that U.S. employers and the United States government have historically played in actually shaping the experience of Mexican migration to the United States. In fact, if we genuinely want to make sense of Mexican migration, I would argue that we really need to begin by assessing the history of American business migration into Mexico. During the 19th century, the United States expanded across the continent into the Pacific and Caribbean. American expansion was violent and often involved warfare. As the United States grew in size and power, American businessmen began migrating beyond the territorial boundaries of the U.S. state, and their migration was encouraged by foreign statesmen. Between 1876 and 1911, Mexico was ruled by an authoritarian, market-oriented president named Porfirio Diaz, who sought to modernize Mexico by courting foreign investment. Heeding Diaz's call, Boston and Colorado bankers and Thomas Nickerson of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway entered Mexico and began constructing a rail network that would eventually tie Texas and Arizona to the Mexican Federal District and the Mexican states of Tamaulipas and Sonora. Here you see the American Santa Fe crossing through Mexico all the way from Chicago en route to the Pacific. As railroadmen began to couple the economies of the United States and Mexico, Americans began acquiring Mexican mines, ranches, and oil fields. Today, many of my colleagues apply to the Guggenheim Foundation to obtain funding for their research. In the late 19th century, Daniel Guggenheim of the Guggenheim Exploration Company entered Mexico, and he secured mines in the states of Durango, Chihuahua, Coahuila, and Zacatecas. In our present, healthcare workers and social workers at university hospitals apply to the Hearst Foundations for research grants, often to study poverty in Mexico. And the Hearsts, like the Guggenheims, initially acquired much of their wealth in Mexico. U.S. Senator George Hearst began purchasing land in Mexico, and then his son, William Randolph Hearst, a newspaper tycoon, added to the family's holdings, which came to total more than 1.6 million acres of land, part of which the Hearsts devoted to a massive cattle ranching operation. In the early 1900s, the American fortune hunter Edward Doheny struck oil in Mexico and then took hold of 600,000 acres of land, which then prompted Standard Oil to expand its operations in Mexico. In the city of Tampico, Americans founded hotels, restaurants, bars, and even a Presbyterian church presided by an American minister. As this sort of brief summary suggests, the American businessmen who migrated into Mexico in this time didn't simply rent apartments or purchase single-family homes. They actually shaped Mexico's economy and environment by creating very powerful American enclaves in Mexico. American capital migration into Mexico was encouraged by some Mexican statesmen, businessmen, and workers who initially believed that foreign investment would lead to economic growth. Mexican workers soon learned, however, that foreign investment also engendered conflicts between foreign companies that wanted to maximize their profits and Mexican workers who desired an adequate standard of living. The Cananea strike is an illustrative example of these contradictions. In the 1890s, William Green migrated into Cananea, Sonora, and founded the Green Consolidated Copper Company and developed the town of Cananea. In June of 1906, Mexican miners in Cananea went on strike, complaining that they received lower wages than the Americans who labored alongside them, and complaining that they never were given managerial opportunities. Green, now known as the, quote, Copper King of Mexico, refused to negotiate with these Mexican miners. Outraged, Mexicans marched to the mines and forced their way onto company property. They were shot at during the violence that followed, and 12 Mexicans and 2 Americans were killed. When Green learned that the miners were remobilizing and arming themselves, he called his ally, the governor of Sonora, Rafael Izabal, and then he contacted the Arizona Rangers in the state of Arizona. Governor Izabal in Mexico now joined forces with 275 armed Americans who crossed into Mexico and suppressed the strike. As this example illustrates, American capital migration into Mexico didn't lead to conflicts solely between Mexicans on the one hand and Americans on the other. As this example shows, during these labor disputes, Mexican statesmen often collaborated with U.S. companies to discipline and suppress Mexican workers who were trying to improve labor conditions in the United States, the very conditions that would encourage them to remain in Mexico and not have to migrate. American business migration began in the 19th century and only accelerated after the border industrialization program of 1965 and after NAFTA in 1994. Today, the U.S. Department of State tells us that more than 18,000 American businesses operate in Mexico, and they've constructed stores, factories, transportation, and communication networks worth billions of dollars. American businessmen have a long history of migrating into Mexico. They are currently profiting in Mexico, and it appears they are there to stay. Yet the business history that I have recounted and the presence of so many U.S. corporations profiting in Mexico is rarely taken into account when discussing whether Mexicans have the right to enter and work in the United States. Ignoring this business history is particularly problematic given that U.S. companies are the ones that established the transportation and communication lines that Mexican migrants would later use to travel to and from the United States. So the very lines that are allowing U.S. manufacturers to send produced goods into Mexico are the very lines that Mexican laborers begin using to travel all the way from cities like Guadalajara up to Chicago. As we entered the 20th century, a pattern of Mexican migration developed that remains to this day. U.S. employers and government officials began encouraging Mexican migration and would even transport Mexicans into the United States during periods of economic expansion, but would discourage migration and even resort to deportation in times of economic contraction. Between the 1880s and World War I, nearly 1 million Europeans had entered the United States per year, and they supplied employers throughout the United States with a massive and very mobile labor force. World War I and then several restrictive immigration acts in the 1920s deprived American companies of their historic supply of mobile European labor. In search of a new mobile and non-union workforce that could be forced to shoulder the layoffs associated with seasonal agricultural work and the vacillating up and down cycles of U.S. industrial production, American businessmen turned to Mexicans, and the U.S. government accommodated this demand by allowing nearly unrestricted Mexican migration. Southwestern growers began recruiting Mexicans who crossed the porous U.S. border. There wasn't a border patrol until 1924. Midwestern companies, meanwhile, hired Mexicans through labor agencies that went into Mexico to recruit Mexican workers, up into places like Chicago. Politicians in favor of migration were quite blunt about the limited role they expected Mexicans to play within American society, as Texas Congressman Olger B. Burtness explained here at an immigration committee. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that Mexicans are the best people on the face of the earth, or that they will have made wonderful citizens, or a few years later they're going to be the sons and daughters graduating from our high schools, our universities, acting as our professors, our teachers, our lawyers. If they were going to be that, if they were going to do that, I don't think we'd want them. By the late 1920s, Mexicans were using those transportation networks that the United States had financed and that they had constructed to travel throughout the United States in search of work opportunities. Mexicans could be found working in Chicago in the steel industry. They could be found working in meatpacking plants in Minnesota. They could be found working for Henry Ford in the automobile industry in Detroit. But as the US economy slipped into the Great Depression after 1929, competition for work increased, Americans lost their jobs, and people began scapegoating Mexicans. Between 1929 and 1941, more than 400,000 Mexicans were deported, while another 75 to 85,000 were aggressively encouraged to repatriate. But just as all of these Depression-era deportations were coming to an end in 41, Europe was once again at war. Seeking to capitalize on World War II production demands, American agriculture and manufacturing companies began calling for the use of Mexican labor, the very labor force that had just been deported. After the United States entered the war, the federal government launched the Bracero program, which ended up recruiting 4.5 million Mexicans to work in the United States between 1942 and 1964. So during World War I, employers relied on an open border and private labor agencies to recruit Mexican laborers into the United States. Now, during World War II, the federal government began recruiting Mexican laborers on behalf of employers. As World War II came to an end, the United States began fighting its Cold War against the Soviet Union. And in the global context of espionage, American politicians began to conflate national security with immigration policies, passing anti-subversive immigration laws in the 1950s. With the start of another recession in 1953, the US federal government now initiated a second mass roundup, mass deportation campaign aimed at the Mexican immigrants, many of whom had just been imported through the Bracero program. However, this time around, the INS deported 2.9 million Mexicans between 1951 and 54, the Department of Labor continued to import hundreds of thousands of Mexicans through the Bracero program. While there are always important factors that compel some people to migrate, in the case of Mexican migrants, US employers and government officials have played a very direct role in shaping their migration history here in the United States. Much remains to be learned about the Mexican deportees of the past and those of the present. In recent times, Mexican migrants have been described as, quote, Hispanic challenges, end quote, that threaten our allegedly isolationist country. According to this narrative, the United States has a long history of receiving people from all over the world, but rarely sends its people, its capital, and culture abroad. Our intimate history with Mexico is completely ignored, and contemporary Mexican migration is discussed as a one-way phenomenon, them coming here. And the Walmarts, the General Electrics, the General Motors, other Generals, and the AT&T stores that have all moved into Mexico are sort of just taken out of the discussion. Mexican migrants have few advocates in public office because they're non-citizens, many of them, and a minimal presence in higher education. Consequently, they're often stereotyped as anti-union laborers. Some migrants are skeptical of unions, but contrary to popular perception, many Latin American migrants have been so pro-union that the US government has actually found it necessary to discipline them. In the context of the Great Depression, a massive labor movement emerged in the United States, led by the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Latin American migrants joined with African Americans and white Americans to help build this progressive labor federation. In California, Mexican immigrant Josefino Fierro de Bright and Guatemalan immigrant Luisa Moreno organized workers to join the United Cannery Workers. In Texas, Nicaraguan immigrant Humberto Silek served as a leader of the Mine Mill Union. In Illinois, Mexican immigrant Refugio Martinez helped establish the United Packing Workers of America. For devoting themselves to the American labor movement, Latino migrants were persecuted by the INS. In the context of all those Cold War deportations, when millions, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans were being deported, radical Latin American labor organizers like Moreno and Martinez were targeted for investigation and were eventually deported. Others like Fierro de Bright were arrested and interrogated so many times they went into self-exile to avoid further interrogations. While Mexican American unionists like Bert Corona were arrested and the INS attempted to deport him, but he could prove through a midwife that he had been born on US soil. And this is him in his World War II fatigues. Unfortunately, just as Latin American unionists were deported from our country, they've been concurrently expelled from our history books, so that today only the CIO activists of the past remember their Latin American migrant allies. The Latin American migrants in the Service Employees International Union today, who are at the forefront of the American labor movement, are part of a long history of labor coalitions between migrants and white and black Americans that needs to be rediscovered in our increasingly anti-immigrant, anti-union political climate. The criminalization and deportation of Mexican migrants exposes a contradiction in our modern way of life that few commentators want to address. And that is, on the one hand, we accept the global market economy that compels businessmen and laborers to migrate. And on the other hand, we accept government policies that legalize and celebrate business migration, but criminalize and denounce labor migration. Put another way, we have open borders for businessmen, but closed borders for workers. This contradiction resolves itself in the super exploitation and at times in the trafficking of Mexicans in the United States, of Poles in the United Kingdom, of the Roma in France, of the Somalis in Italy, of Nigerians in Spain, and the list goes on. I therefore conclude with one possible solution to what clearly is not an American dilemma of undocumented migration, but is actually an international problem, the illegalization of working class migration. In 1922, the Texas affiliate of the American Federation of Labor organized an international convention with labor organizers from Mexico. The president of the local, George H. Slater, believing that Mexican migrants were apolitical at best and probably anti-union at worst, conferred with Mexican unionists over several days, and then went to the press and said, quote, "I was under the impression that I was going to be able to offer some service to the representatives of the labor movement of Mexico, and after hours of conference, I discovered I was being taught what the labor movement could do." Slater was referring to a proposal by Mexican unionists who wanted to create an international labor organization and a labor movement that would seek to regulate migration and protect migrants by raising the standard of living on workers on both sides of the US and Mexico border. After debating the proposal for several hours, the American unionists concluded that while they agreed with the principle of a truly international union that would be organizing collectively workers on both sides of the border, they simply did not have the power to implement such an ambitious plan, a plan that would require Americans and Mexicans to organize across borders and across cultures. As Americans, we may want to take a page from a Mexican worker's life if we want to make sense of Mexican migration so that we can begin thinking of a plan of action for the day when we no longer have the option of just discussing international migration and the exploitation of these people, but we too have been forced to migrate by our global market economy. Thank you.
Why don't we wait and have questions at the end of the panel? Dr. Rachel Lavelle of the Legal Center.
I'll just sit down here. Can I just? Oh, okay. I won't sit down. Okay.
See if I can turn off this. Do you mind if I sit?
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, what I prepared today is very different from what Dr. Flores prepared, and I have a complete different area and specialization. So just change gears, very much change gears, I guess. I'll talk a little bit about what my area of specialization is within the area of trafficking. I've written a couple of pieces on, so I'm a sociologist by training and a quantitative methodologist by practice. So I work at the Begun Center here at Case as basically a quantitative methodologist. So I specialize in how to measure and things and how to design research. I've written two pieces that have to do, although I definitely think we should talk about the fact that trafficking most often when people talk about trafficking, what they mean is sex trafficking, because that's the sort of, no pun intended, sexier part of trafficking. But labor trafficking is a huge part, and in fact, the ILO estimates, International Labor Organization, that labor trafficking by numbers is much larger than sex trafficking, and I think doesn't get nearly as much attention as sex trafficking. But my area isn't within labor trafficking, but acknowledging that that's a huge part of the trafficking dialogue. But my area is within the sex trafficking stuff. So I've written two pieces that are reports, not publications, for dissemination, wide dissemination. One is a critique of the first John School that was done in San Francisco in the mid-1990s. There was a report done funded by NIJ that showed a 50% reduction in recidivism from a John school. And part of this paper that I wrote with a colleague of mine, Ann Jordan, who does a lot with trafficking as well, was critiquing the methodology in that John School report that they wrote. Basically, just saying that the stats that they use, they can't really say that what they say, and we don't know whether it's as effective as what they say. And all of the criminology literature seems to suggest a 50% reduction in recidivism is astronomically high, and 40 years of criminology literature doesn't support the fact that an 8-hour school on a Saturday would completely change someone's behavior as an intervention. Something else I wrote was critiquing. I moved from DePaul about a year and a half ago. I worked at DePaul. And there's a very large in-demand Illinois group and probably the largest in-demand organization, which is, how many of you are familiar with in-demand as a movement? Or the John Schools. Okay, sorry. Okay, good. So in-demand is a international funded a large part by the Hunt Initiative, but it's a movement to focus the intention of sex work instead of arresting the sex workers and putting pressure on sex workers, we're going to focus on the demand side. So instead of focusing on the supply side of sex work, we're going to focus on the demand side of sex work, which it has a lot of initiatives. One of that being a John School, which is like equivalent of like going to traffic court. You know, you go on a Saturday and you learn how you should be a better driver. They go on a Saturday. They go on a Saturday and they learn why not to buy sex from women. It's their first offense. It's all street level. And if they pay this money and they go on a Saturday, their record is a sponge. So that's a John School. So there's many iterations of in-demand movement, but Illinois has probably the state with the strongest in-demand movement. And so another colleague of mine wrote a paper showing that what in-demand wanted to do was increase penalties for men who buy sex. At the time, in Ohio or in Illinois, a second offense for a woman of prostitution was a felony. And every subsequent one was a felony. So, you know, you had some women, in particular street-level sex workers, who had 100, 150 felony offenses for prostitution. Were just going into county. I mean, you know, they were just going into county, coming out of county, going into county. And it was the only prostitution-related offense that was a felony. So in-demand tried to create laws to felonize many of the demand side, the buyer side. And my colleague and I wrote a paper showing the unintended consequences of that. Because if you look at at the time, if you look at the reports of who gets arrested, so there's three things within sex work, right? There's the buyers, mostly men. We're going to assume most buyers are men, although that's not always the case, but that's a fairly good assumption. The sellers, which are both men and women and trans individuals, but most sex work focuses on women as the sellers. And then there's the negotiators, those that are pimps or arrangers or however you want to see it, those who connect the buyers with the sellers. Of course, the negotiator doesn't always have to be there, but can be. If you look at the records of who's been arrested, 50% of all the arrangers in Illinois between 2000 and 2010 were women. How can this? Why are 50% of all the people being arranging? How are they women? Right? Because that's not who we think of as a pimp, right? Well, what happens oftentimes is that it's hard to get a prostitution offense because you have to be caught in the act. So police will charge women who are, in fact, sellers with an arranging offense because it's much easier to get that offense. So what in-demand Illinois was trying to do was then felonize that without necessarily taking into account that a lot of those were actually women who they were trying to help, but there was this unintended consequences of how the law actually plays out. Since then, Illinois has changed some of its laws. I get whistled at, that's nice. So these are some of the stuff that I've worked on. But my real area of interest as a methodologist is to study how to find trafficking. And I think one of the biggest, I think there's just well, when I got into this field, I was shocked as a methodologist by how just horrible the research was. It's just, I mean, in no way in a lot of these places is this justifiable, publishable, solid scientific types of research designs. These are people doing snowball samples, asking 50 people, what do you think about this? Have you been trafficked? So forth. So I'm very interested in the part of trafficking where trafficking is probably one of the most hidden populations, trafficked individuals, right? So to assume that we have very good estimates is pretty ridiculous. To assume that we know what the trafficking world actually looks like is pretty ridiculous unless you get into the nitty-gritty. There's one report by the John Jay School, and they've done a very good job using what's called random blanking. Random. That's what you have. That's what you get when you have a 4-month-old who was up all night. It's right there. I did this yesterday too. Respondent-driven sampling. There it is. I knew it was down in the recesses there. Respondent-driven sampling, which is doing a very intentional snowball sample. They went into, it's in New York City, and they went into all the areas where people, they were just looking at adolescents who sell sex, street-level adolescents, and studied them intensively. Mm-hmm, Brian? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I get used to talking to certain fields and I forget. So a snowball sample is when, say, I ask Rhonda for a survey, and then I say, do you know anyone else that can help me? And she then says, okay, I know John. And then I ask John about the study, and then he goes. So it's not a random sample. It's based upon who I know, who she knows, and so forth. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with that type of design, but it doesn't give you a good picture because the picture is only who my connections are with, right? This does it very differently, where it's more it actually uses mathematical formulas and algorithms to find samples, and their study is very unique in that they went out, they did this for years as sort of a mix of qualitative and quantitative study, and what they found of these youth was that most of them, when we think of underage people being trafficked, we think of the movie Taken, where it's pretty white girls who go overseas and somehow get taken by Eastern Europeans and drugged in a bed. That sort of image of a trafficked person. Or we think of, someone being drugged and bound to a bed and all that stuff. But in fact, the image is very different. And in this case, these were underage kids, the vast majority of whom were part of this social welfare system, child welfare, and had run away from either their foster care or their placement in some sort. So these are kids, most of them people of color, who were in the system, who had chosen to run away from the child welfare system and live on the street as a street-level, low-level sex worker, making very low wages for things that most of us would seem is to not want to do for $10, then be back in the child welfare system, which I think speaks very poorly of our child welfare system, but not just our child welfare system, but of all the things, economic inequality, of the social justice system, all of the things that kind of create this, not just to pick on child welfare, because it's sort of the whole kit and caboodle. They also found that most of them didn't have pimps. Only 10% of these kids had pimps. And they found some really interesting things by going there and studying them day after day after day and finding them in the hard way of studying things. So I think that's where my interest is. And I think for human trafficking, in terms of defining it, it gets defined in a multitude of ways. sometimes all sex work is seen as being trafficking, and most sex workers would disagree with you that they are not trafficked, nor are they victims. And by taking away their human agency and saying, no, to do this, you must be trafficked, you must be forced, you must have no power, is offensive to many sex workers and sex worker organizations. But this is not to say that this doesn't happen, because we, of course, know that it does. But why it does and what we can do to rescue them is often not given as much thought, I think, as could be about what you can, because you're not just rescuing a kid from a bad situation, you're rescuing a kid who needs lots of help, not just from that bad situation. They were in a situation where they were in foster care, and they chose, most of them, to escape the foster system or the child welfare system and do other things. So they don't just need rescued from the street, they need lots of help. So I'll stop. I don't know where to stop. I could go on forever. I'll probably stop there. And then I think most of what I would know, though, was probably more in a dialogue that we could have. I do know lots of studies. Brian?
If you could just talk a little bit more, if there are any studies out there that you think are good examples of ways to study trafficking. But it sounds like some of the studies focus on local, like Chicago. What about the international level? Have you encountered anything?
I would say in my area is not as much in the international. The John Jay School is one of the first ones that I think did a good job. They have since got more money, and they are replicating that study in Chicago and several other areas. I think the first place you have to start is in the large cities. Not that it doesn't happen we know it happens here in Cleveland as well, but that's where the hotbeds are. I mean, like, if you look at, for example, I had records for all prostitution-related offenses in Illinois. From the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority gave us all that data when I was at DePaul. 90% of it was in Chicago for the whole state of all the offenses. I mean, it's just going to happen, although, people in Chicago don't actually believe that there's anything else in Illinois besides Chicago, right? You're like, downstate? What's downstate? We are the state, right? So I think the first good ones have to really focus on select cities and really get into the media. And by doing that, Brian and I were having this conversation, I think by doing that, you get an idea of how it works. Who's doing the trafficking? How do they get people? How do they keep people staying there? What are ways to help? I think you have to go really in depth for that. For international, it's much harder to do that. And I don't have this specialization. My colleague, Ann Jordan, has done, so if you're interested in looking at some of that stuff, Ann Jordan does a lot of stuff with the international trafficking, and she was with Americans University. They have a law school. It's like 12 different centers, and I'm going to get them wrong, but she was at American University in the law school and had a human rights and trafficking center specifically within their law school, and she had a lot of, she did stuff in Nepal and elsewhere that she hasn't. So I won't speak as much on international because it's not my area. Okay. Yeah, and then questions at the end.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you. Our third speaker, Ms. Dale, you can really introduce yourself, but Ms. Carol Skutnik, who is an assistant U.S. attorney here in Northern Ohio, has been in the prosecuting business for 22 years. Has been with the U.S. Attorney's Office here for a little less than 6 years. Very busy person, as everyone else participating, but has been very busy lately, so thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Well, good morning, everyone. As, boy, if you were a jury, I'd really give you some heck for that. I've had the pleasure of working with Brian and speaking at events on his behalf or at his request, and it's a pleasure to come this morning. As he indicated, my name's Carol Skutnik. I'm an assistant United States attorney. I've been a prosecutor for 22 years now. and I've been with the U.S. Attorney's Office for about 5.5 years. I spent a good portion of my career as a prosecutor prosecuting sex offenders. It wasn't until I came to the U.S. Attorney's Office that I became more familiar with issues regarding trafficking in humans. And now the Department of Justice has launched an initiative across the country and has made trafficking matters a priority for the Department of Justice. And I know that within the Northern District of Ohio, which is the upper half of Ohio, where you, which is our district here, our U.S. Attorney, Stephen Dettelbach, has made this matter one of his primary initiatives in his tenure as U.S. Attorney. We have a Civil Rights Division, and under the Civil Rights Division fall the topics of both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. It is my area of expertise is certainly, or I don't know that I can call myself an expert, but certainly my area of familiarity is more in the area of sex trafficking, but I do know that we have prosecuted labor trafficking cases. They are, I think, more difficult to investigate and put together and less reported. But I'm just sort of going to tailor my topic or my conversation with you this morning on the matter of sex trafficking because it is something that I have more experience with. It's interesting as I was listening to my fellow speakers, you know, and what I'm hearing as they're talking is really no different than what I do for a living, and that is, you know, power and economics. Money drives the practice. If there was no monetary reward, I think at the end of the ordeal, there would be no interest in exploiting other human beings, whether that be for labor, which puts money in people's pocket, whether that be for sex, which puts money in people's pockets, or any other type of exploitation. And sadly, sex trafficking has really become rampant in the United States. I remember when I first started out, fresh out of college, fresh out of law school, and I was the city of Cleveland prosecutor, and on a daily basis they would bring folks in from the jail, and I might have a docket of about 150, sometimes 200 cases, and they would bring in the women from the jail from the night before, and it would be all soliciting or prostitution-related offenses. They were misdemeanors, and you know, 9 times out of 10, the woman would come in and she'd say, you know, hi, Judge Conley, you know, and she would walk in and stand against the wall, and it was like, you know, day in and day out. They were arrested for prostitution-related offenses, and they'd come in the jail door and they'd go out the jail door, and they might get a few days in jail and they would be back on the streets. And there were programs that attempted to help those women to try to change their circumstances and change the situation. And then there would be the Johns, as we say. By the way, I'm not supposed to say John because that's really derogatory to men named John, right? That's very un-PC, right, John? But you know, the men would, typically men, frankly, I've never had a case involving a female who was purchasing sex, would come in through the back door because they generally had jobs, some of them very well employed. They would sit in the courtroom with all of the other offenders that may have been there for a traffic offense or disorderly conduct or something. They would come up, they'd pay their fine, and they'd go home. And that was my first exposure, really, to this world. I didn't understand a lot about it. It was just a process. It was a revolving door. What I'm doing now is different than that. There is a lot of debate, and it's not the purpose of my conversation here with you this morning about whether or not people may choose to engage in those acts for money as a means to make a living. My job is very specific. It is not about choice. It is about people who are being exploited by someone else in order for that other person, the exploiter, to make money. And I have learned as an AUSA that across the country there are hotbeds for sexual trafficking organizations. I have learned that it has become a very popular means of making money for gangs. As drug prosecutions have increased and penalties have increased, some gangs have actually moved away from the distribution of narcotics and moved into sex trafficking because it is incredibly profitable for them to do so. And there are fresh victims on the street every day. We are not, in Ohio, thank goodness, one of the leading cities in the United States for abduction and trafficking and transportation of juveniles. I know that there are a number of places across the country where there's actually what's known as a track, where they will take kids or juveniles, minors, or even young adults from a certain area, and they will move them around. I know that John Morgan is here, and he works with our task force. That is just simply amazing. And you may hear about a little bit more of that later in one of the later presentations. But what I will say is that there is definitely a growth in sex trafficking here in our area, and it is far more subtle than you might expect. The federal statutes, there is one primary statute that deals with sex trafficking. It's under the United States Code. It's under Section 1591, and it deals with specifically trafficking in humans for purposes of commercial sex acts. And it carries quite a bite. If you are the individual who is trafficking another, and it is a juvenile, and you are, or a minor defined as somebody under the age of 18, and you are convicted of trafficking a minor but not involving force, fraud, or coercion, which is hard to imagine, that is a mandatory minimum term of incarceration of 10 years up to 30 years. If you are involved in trafficking another, whether that be a minor or an adult, and it involves force, fraud, or coercion, it is a mandatory minimum of 15 years, and it can be up to life. I want to talk a little bit about a couple of the cases that I have worked on to give you a sense of the importance of the force, fraud, or coercion aspect, because that's really what makes it a federal offense. It's what makes it trafficking. There are basically three elements to the federal offense. And the first is basically the actions that mean that you are the trafficker. So this is not really focused on the purchaser. This is the individuals who are exploiting others. And that is, a lot of words like harbor, maintain, obtain, procure, things of that nature. And basically that's everything from going out and recruiting to keeping up in a household or providing basic needs. It could be promoting, which in today's society is by far on the internet. That's the most popular way that this occurs. And also receiving the proceeds of. The next element of the offense has to do with an interstate nexus, which is what makes it a federal offense. By the way, there are excellent state statutes that are now coming out, including one in the state of Ohio, which in large part mirrors the federal offenses, so these can be prosecuted in the state as well. The penalties are not as high, but they are certainly far higher and far better than where we were at 20 years ago when I started my career. But the most important element, and the one that is most difficult to prove, which is that the acts are committed and that the person knows or is reckless in basically acknowledging that force, fraud, or coercion will be used to compel a person to engage in a commercial sex act. Commercial sex act is not difficult to understand. I mean, it's basically committing a sexual act for some sort of remuneration, whether that's financial, money, cash, exchanging hands, or some other benefit of a financial nature. And by the way, it doesn't matter if the individual engaged in the sex act is actually receiving part of that money. That is not, that doesn't make it a business venture. So, force, fraud, or coercion. in your mind, I'm saying 3 words, you're hearing 1. I'm certain of it, and this is the thing that we have to overcome when we work with, when we get out in the community, and certainly when we appear in front of a jury. Because people are thinking beatings, they're thinking abductions, they're thinking weapons or threats, and certainly the more obvious and direct manner of putting somebody's life in jeopardy or causing somebody to fear for their safety. And that is obviously a manner or technique that is used by individuals, by pimps, to control women or to control men who are being exploited and engaging in sex acts, and it does occur. What I find is that the more common thing that we are seeing here, but equally as powerful, is in the element of coercion. Last week I finished a trial down in the Akron courthouse for some events that had been occurring in Elyria in Lorain County. And it was a 2-week trial, and we started out with 4 victims. And those, we had 4 because 4 were willing to cooperate with us. There were more, but as I will talk about in a minute, it is often very, very difficult to get cooperation from your victims. But in this particular case, what was occurring was the pimp, who, by the way, had just gotten out of prison in November of 2012, started dealing drugs in November of 2012, and quickly lured in and brought in a group of young, incredibly beautiful women who were addicted, in this case predominantly to heroin. There was a young girl that was using cocaine, but his drug of choice was heroin. He was a heroin dealer, and it was really quite amazing to watch this man work. He didn't addict, he didn't give the drugs to people who had never used heroin before. I mean, it was something far easier, right? He had girls coming to the house that were addicted to heroin, and I'm sure that all of you are aware of really how rampant heroin is right now in our high schools and with minors and young adults. So he has all of these girls who are using heroin or who have been using prescription medication in a non-prescribed way, such as OxyContin, and turn them to heroin. And from there, he then begins to front the heroin. And to a heroin user, it's like, oh, it's Christmas, right? Free goodies. I got free heroin. I'm coming back. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll be back tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. And then he picks and chooses, you know? Maybe, maybe me, not so much. Not going to make him a lot of money on Backpage, right? So I don't get a lot of free heroin. I might get a debt that goes up to about $50, and that's it. I'm capped until I go, break into some house somewhere or boost some stuff out of the store or steal from my family and come up with some collateral. But to these beautiful young girls, what he did was he kept fronting heroin. And then it was, you can have sex with me, and I'll just give you heroin. So they thought. And so he kept giving them heroin, and they kept coming back. And if you have ever talked to a heroin addict, an incredible description, a great quote from one of our witnesses. When she said, when I first took heroin, it became my one and only love. It was more important to me than life itself. And so as he continued to give the heroin, they become more and more in debt, more and more in debt. And before you know it, in 1 or 2 weeks, their debt is up into the thousands. And he said, now you need to go to work for me. You need to pay off your debt before I will give you any more heroin. And let me tell you, it's the opposite. It is not, I'm going to beat you, or I'm going to put a gun to your head, which is an obvious showing of force. It's the exact opposite. If you don't get from me what you need, in this case heroin, you will suffer the most horrific, painful physical consequences you could possibly experience as a human being. Heroin withdrawal is one of the most horrific physical experiences, short of, perhaps, I don't need to compare it. It's horrible. And now he has all of the control that he needs. And in this situation, the physical consequence is the withdrawal of heroin. Nobody else is going to front these girls heroin. It's not a great business model, right? Give away your drugs. Mastermind. And then he's got all these little people who are coming to the house to buy heroin. That maybe he fronts, 10 here, 20 there, whatever. And so then he enlists them to give rides, or to go buy condoms, or to go get him the debit cards that he needs, to get on the internet and post the ads. And so he's got all these little, heroin bees working for him, while he then selects the individuals, the women that he wants to go out and prostitute for him. And let me tell you, I mean, these girls could make for him probably $1,000 to $2,000 a day. Every single penny of the money went to him, right? Because they owed him money for his heroin debt. So not one penny went to them. Not that it mattered. And so not only was he making all of the money on selling drugs, but he was multiply that by, 4, 5, 6 girls at a time. By the day, he was counting, some people testified that they would count anywhere from $15,000 to $40,000 a day from his drug distribution and his sex trafficking operations. It's incredibly profitable. And see, that circles back to where we began, where it's all about money and economics and the exploitation of people who can make you money. That's an example of sort of an untraditional means of force, but it's an example of how individuals are operating in our society today in order to exploit people who have vulnerabilities. The interesting thing about the law is you take the person or the victim as you find them. So in this case, it's not whether I would be overcome by the offer of heroin or I would be overcome by the denial or refusal of heroin. It's whether an individual who is addicted to heroin, which is the drug in my case, whether they would be overcome, whether their will would be overcome by removing that from their lifestyle. And that's how that exploitation occurred. Another instance that I had involved a young girl who at the age of 12, her mother prostituted her out to migrant farm workers. And years later, her mother was prosecuted and put in jail. But guess what? That child now, at the age of 14, 15, 16, knew one skill. She knew how to make money. And she had run away from 8 different foster homes. She was on the streets. That was her preferred place to be. And when she was on the streets, she had only one skill, the one that she was taught, the one that was passed down by her mother. And so while she was on the street, she would engage in acts of prostitution. And then there would be individuals, sort of like wolves, that would come along and would, again, you can pick them out. They have an incredible ability to pick people out who are vulnerable. And this particular individual, assured her that he could make more money for her if he would help her to get posted on Backpage, which is basically an internet classified ad which operates nationwide. And he did, and she brought a friend who was also 16 years old. And thank goodness the first purchaser was an undercover Toledo police officer. And so thankfully that sex act didn't occur. But I can guarantee you that since the trial, because we did go to trial in that case, I can guarantee you that since that trial she has engaged in other acts of prostitution because she doesn't know how to do anything else. And it's very, very difficult to unring that bell.
I don't even know if it's that she doesn't know how to do anything else. Like, what other opportunities are there for someone like that? You could work for minimum wage for hours and hours and get nowhere, or it's like the economic system, like she was saying. It's not even, she sounds smart. She can probably do lots of things, but why, in her opinion? I'm thinking about her.
Right. And and I know I know that I have been on panels with Renee before, and I know that every day I am more and more educated on the matter. What I know is that when she leaves, when she runs away from the foster home or whatever's being provided to her and she is on the streets, there is a skill that she knows how to make quick money, and that is the skill that she pulls out of her toolbox, and that's what she goes to. I can talk to you, you know, I understand that I'm here in sort of a legal capacity, and by the way, I should probably say that the opinions expressed here and the comments expressed here are not those of the Department of Justice, but just Carol Skutnick and my experience. You know, and I know that I can bring slides and I can talk to you about, you know, these are the elements and these are the legal requirements. But what I really find is what opens up conversation is not a bunch of PowerPoints about what the federal law is. What opens up conversations are really the difficulties. When I talk to you about sort of case studies, and I talk to you about the difficulty of putting these cases together. The difficulty of getting cooperation from these individuals, which is far more than I can talk about in 15 minutes, you know, and I know that you will hear from other professionals. But, you know, sadly, the person that I'm generally struggling the most with, in spite of all of you know, my life experiences and skills and work as a prosecutor, the person that I am struggling usually the most with come trial time is trying to get a victim to stay with me, to come to court, and to testify against the very person that has exploited them. This is not an easy job, and it is not an easy thing to convince others of, to convince jurors of oftentimes, that there is some element of coercion or force. Fortunately, we had a very positive experience last week. The individual that I spoke of was convicted of all counts, including one count for a victim who didn't even testify, based upon the conversation and testimony of others. And she didn't want to testify because she was still in love with him. She wrote him letters that she intended to marry him, that she would stand by him. And her quote to us when we talked about how he was using her and so on and so forth was, "Well, he treated me better than other guys I've been with." So I guess, just to wrap up, you know, and sort of round out what we talked about so far this morning, is that as long as there are economic opportunities, money to be made from the exploitation of others, there will be people who come up with different ways to coerce people who are vulnerable victims in our society for their own benefit and good. And I don't know how we fix that, but I feel that the greatest work has to be done really in taking away those opportunities and letting people know who are on the streets or who are in vulnerable positions that there is help for them, and sort of empowering them. Just as a final footnote, one of the girls that we worked with, who was our primary victim, who was the first person to come forward, will celebrate 6 months of being clean and sober from heroin on March 12th, God willing, one day at a time. And to me, that was the biggest accomplishment in this case, which started 1 year ago, is that there was one girl who walked away who is at least 5.5 months clean right now, and not sitting in drug houses. So, thanks.
So we're going to go into Q&A right now, and I think the point that Carol ended on is a kind of good point of summary, and we can take the questions wherever the questions go, but the question of economic opportunity, economic injustice, economic oppression, the relationship to power, the relationship to obviously money and money to be made, what that means not only in terms of sex trafficking, as it's been talked about, but labor trafficking. And it was really interesting for me to hear from Carol that labor trafficking is even harder to build cases on and actually document and prosecute. So I want us to give some consideration to the full gamut of exploitation that we talked about this morning. I want us to give some attention to the full gamut of trafficking, both in terms of labor and sex trafficking, and how all that relates to this question of economics. And of course, any questions you have. The other thing I would just like to say is that it seems to me that we're talking about both legal systems and quote unquote illegal systems, right? So what John was talking about was a legal system. in place, right? That may result in what people then begin to consider illicit smuggling, but it is a legal system and practice. And so I don't want us to lose that as we also focus on then the quote unquote illegal opportunities that are in place or put in place for those to get opportunities to make money in an illegal way. So, this first panel is about modalities of labor exploitation. So I'd love for us to have a real full conversation about all of those parameters and the questions that you have. So with that, we have a microphone. If you have a question, please wait for the microphone to get to you so that we can make sure we're filming. So just so you know, make sure that it gets heard, and then
It's not going to amplify your voice.
Right.
It's to record your voice.
And if our speakers could touch the mic, perfect.
So when you do ask your question, if you would, please just say your first name or all your name.
Hi, my name is Craig Bourne. I wonder if the panelists have any familiarity with the global struggle for a minimum wage, which is an effort to repair some of the exploitative conditions that we're talking about, particularly in wage labor exploitation. As for instance, one finds it in India, which has amassed movement among workers that's also well organized.
I'm probably going to go with you, John.
Okay.
Maybe one answer.
Struggle for a global minimum wage.
No, I think the ILO and other organizations often talk about creating some sort of global standard of labor that would attempt to equalize the conditions that in many ways would, from their perspective, help control in some way the migration that's taking place, that is placing people in these positions where they're considered aliens, illegals, etc., and then are vulnerable to super exploitation and are in a position where they're not going to receive minimum wages, and then by a number of accounts end up in a very collateral way being an option for employers, that the people who have to be paid minimum wage to are no longer as profitable. So in other words, this movement to standardize wages across the board is one of the dreams of many labor organizations. And I think it's an incredible challenge. It's an incredible challenge because we do live in a world of nation states, and these labor organizers would be, I think, have to be collaborating with each other and crossing international borders. And I think there is a question of state sovereignty here. What rights do these laborers from all these other places have the right to come into the United States, for example, or for our labor unions to go into other places and actually create these types of collaborative projects? And this has been a challenge, I would argue, right, of the labor movement since since the 1800s, since the formation of labor unions. This has been one of their challenges.
Yeah, I think we couldn't even get in Tennessee, right? They couldn't. The Volkswagen plant just couldn't in Tennessee. They voted, right? Everyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah, like we can't even in the United States get organizations to represent, especially in the South.
Carol, I'm going to call in.
Well, this is not a matter of getting organizations recognized, but a matter of existing organizations developing solidarity, as you say, across national lines, and realizing that the wage situation among a hyper-exploitable minority in India, say, or in China, where workers may be by large American corporations getting paid 32 cents a day. This affects wages in America also, as it has a downward pressure on wages everywhere. So hence the struggle for a global minimum wage.
I think one of the, I'll jump in and sit down, I got a mic. One of the things Rachel was also referring to was the struggles within the labor movement and workers themselves to either vote for or vote against their own organizing advantages. So, and how do you deal with that kind of coercion within a business legal model in the United States that could perpetuate and undermine the minimum wage and perpetuate labor exploitation, which can be part of the driving mechanism that can contribute to, but not necessarily be conflated with, trafficking as we're talking about it. So,
I was going to ask, victims that you've worked with, and we were talking before about, what their toolbox consists of. if they can go out and make much more money doing sex trafficking or prostitution compared to like the minimum wage? Is that a factor in some of their decisions?
I think money is always a factor, and for some people it's money for basic needs. People who are living on the street, obviously, it's more of an issue. And one of the other techniques that I talked about, was drug addiction. Obviously, there are different things that make people vulnerable. Lack of money is one of them. An addiction or a dangerous or violent support, or lack of a support system, something like that, and an unhealthy environment. There are a number of things that certainly contribute to making somebody vulnerable, to place them in a position where they may encounter, individuals who are prepared to exploit them. So, for example, making money was not important, to these young ladies in the most recent case, because all they cared about was receiving heroin. And in this case, heroin was the money. It was the carrot to go out and do what they had to do. But it is problematic, and this is not unique to trafficking, that, for example, minors or young adults don't have a defined skill set or a marketable skill set, and so what they're left with is what's available to them or what they may know. And in the young girl's situation, that was what she knew. She knew how to engage in acts of prostitution for very fast money. I don't think I'm qualified to form an opinion about whether or not, we have a lot of kids out there that don't have a skill set or don't have, access to better jobs or better education and a number of things that may make them vulnerable, but they don't necessarily wind up in such an extreme situation such as this one. So it's really hard to say, Brian.
Hi, my name's Marley. I'm a graduate student at Case Western Reserve University at the My name's Marley. I'm a graduate student at the Case Western Reserve University at the Mandel School for Social Sciences. I'm just going to come right off of your thing here. Economics is not the only thing. And I think if you guys think about that, as your example of the girl whose mother prostituted her out to migrant farm workers or migrant workers, think about how she feels about herself, too. Even if you did decide to give her a skill to do something else for much less money, because there's not a lot of things out there that is going to make as much money as sex, what does she feel about herself? She feels like she's already lost. She feels like she's done. They need much more than just training. They need counseling to help them understand that they're valued as a person. Her own mother sold her out. What does she think about herself? There's that worthless, helpless aspect. And if prostituting herself out makes her feel like she has some sort of control, that's the other thing that we need to supply besides an economic opportunity and a skill, is counseling to feel like, I'm a person. I didn't deserve that.
I have a little bit to say, I think, along those lines, in terms of what the research says about this. And I think what the research is saying is that we have the incorrect model for how, in particular, sex trafficking and exploitation works. So, like I said before, we sort of think about this idealized notion of like a pimp with like a crazy outfit and a cane, and he like beats women and so forth. But what I think you talked about and what the research says is that it's a much more complicated, that in fact it mirrors much more a domestic violence situation than an exploitative one, where if the studies will show, when you ask women who are in sex work, and in particular street level and started underage, they call them their boyfriends, they don't call them their pimps. They say, well, he treats me the best out of everyone. So if we use this model of like in particular a man just like subjugating a woman and forcing her do you know what it would be hard if a woman really wanted to escape very easily, like literally like me just bolting, how hard it would be to like force me to stay in a situation. It doesn't happen that way. for example, this organization in Chicago called YWEP. Has anyone ever heard of YWEP? It's a Young Women Empowerment Project. And it's a grassroots organization that they're comprised of young women aged like 15 to 25. Many of them are in street level survival sex or street level sex work, and they do some interesting work, participatory action research, which is basically they're participating in part of the research project, and they say, as street-level sex workers who are underage, that their greatest sources of conflict and is from police officers who are demanding sex for them for not being arrested, or for harassing them, or forcing them to go back to DCFS, or whatever. So, like, our idea of who is the bad person here, or that the bad person is that this man who we could just pick and say, if we just take this man out of the equation, it will make it better. It's not necessarily, I think, the correct model. Instead, the research seems to suggest it's much more complicated. And if we keep continuing to try to just rescue from this one bad man without fixing the litany of problems that go along with a woman thinking that a man who would pimp her out for $5 is her boyfriend, maybe that's really getting at the key part of what's going on. And to do that, I think the research has to take a different viewpoint of how this situation works by talking to the people like in YWEP, who are the ones who are underage women doing street level sex, and trans. There's a large trans population in YWEP. Asking them, who do you think are the ones that are exploiting you? Who are the ones that are your greatest sources of making your life hard?
Just if I could, I mean, that brings up a really interesting point, and I think probably the message that I'm trying to get across is the solution to this problem is not really in criminal prosecution. Mm-hmm. Because, and I think that's sort of what I touched on, is just how difficult it is to prosecute these cases, how hard it is to have individuals who are willing to cooperate with you. And that goes back to when I was talking earlier, too, about how difficult it is to prosecute labor trafficking cases. And that is because oftentimes you will have people who may be here illegally, who are being exploited for their labor, and they are very, they lack any trust in the system or with people who are associated with the system, fear deportation or worse, and are not, likely or interested in cooperating with authorities against the people who have brought them here and engaged in some type of oppressive behavior. And the same is true when we're talking about sex. And there are so many dynamics, social dynamics to the relationships between whether it's male or female sex workers, as you say. It doesn't matter whether they're minors or adults, male or female. The fact of the matter is there are so many other dynamics to the relationship that it's very difficult to get cooperation. Mm-hmm. So while the penalties may be incredibly high, it's really hard to get to the point of conviction. Mm-hmm. And then we're talking about cherry picking off one person at a time, and somebody else just grows into their place. These are really, really hard cases, and that's why this problem and this issue is so much bigger. For me, I'm just a very, very small piece in this whole process. I am not going to solve this problem, and I say I, as in prosecutors or police officers across the country. Really, the solution comes from the grassroots. It comes from people like that are sitting in this room.
Following on to what you were just saying about that you think the real solutions may lie outside of the judicial system. I'd like to pose a question for both of the two ladies, because you talked about yours from the perspective of studying, mm-hmm. and yours from the perspective of prosecution. I would be curious in your opinions on whether prostitution, in cases where it's not been demonstrated that there is coercion, force, or fraud, whether, in your opinions, those should be felonies for either the John or the person who's giving the service. And if you don't feel that they should be felonies, at what level do you think they should be punished, if at all?
Wow. You know, that's a great question. And I can just put my 2 cents in, and I'm not sure that I have an answer to that. But, you know, I hearken back to my days when I was a city prosecutor, and I mentioned when I first started speaking about, you know, dealing with individuals who were either arrested for engaging in acts of prostitution or people who were arrested for purchasing sex. I didn't find either one of, you know, I didn't find, in my experience, and I'm just saying anecdotally, by the fact that you kept seeing the same faces of typically women, but not always women, but you kept seeing the same faces day after day after day in different courtrooms who kept getting arrested. I'm not sure that that was in any way a solution to the problem. But what's bad about that comment is I don't know what the solution is. I don't know what the alternative to that is, because the upshot of that is it is oftentimes the only way that you will have access to people to say, if you would like to become involved in you know, some type of rehabilitation program, you know, where you can deal with your addictions, or you can deal with whatever issues, you know, are putting you in this position or have you on the street, because most of those individuals were generally, you know, either flopping from place to place or living on the street. It's a means of access. It's a means of getting information to them. It's a way to get them connected with other people. But it doesn't always work. I mean, you know, there is some level of choice here as to whether or not you pick up those new tools. You carry a new toolbox. When it comes to prosecuting people who are buying sex, I do believe there is value in education, which is not uncommon in the legal system. I mean, when you have people arrested for DUIs, you send them to, you know, programs where they have to watch videos about how people are, you know, killed by drunk drivers and so on and so forth. So you hope that there's a fear factor and an education. And if you educate somebody who's buying sex, that, you know, you can educate them on what this person is going through in order to meet you at the motel. So there's pluses, there's positives, it's access, but I don't know that prosecution is effective. I don't think making it a felony would make it any more effective. I think that what we're trying to do is kind of prosecute some of the worst of the worst. I do believe that there are people who are exploiting others, I find, is in a far different category than people who are fighting for survival. And engaging in these acts on their own. But I'm not sure that prosecution is the solution. And certainly elevating prosecution, I'm not sure is going to be helpful.
Yeah. I come from a different perspective, where I would say that if you look at it cross-nationally, I would say that the research seems to suggest that sex workers, whether it's both legal, underage or adult level, forced or not forced, that in situations where everything is above the table, a complete decriminalization of both the buying and selling has the best outcomes for both of those. So if you look at, for example, the Netherlands has, you can buy and you can sell, you have specialized areas. And in by no way is probably ideal for that, but the sex workers are, when there is some form of labor trafficking, like Eastern Europeans tend to come into the Netherlands, it's about, look at what the war on drugs has done. When you put all this persecution, everything goes under the table, which makes it much more unsafe for the women involved in this, and because it has to be a lot more secretive. So the research seems to suggest that that when it's above the table and you can regulate it, you have women who have pay taxes, who have regular exams, who have Johns come into a place where they know that it's safe, they don't have to go in the back alley, they, you know, whatever, that the women are safer. There's also a version of that, what's called the Swedish model, where the selling of sex is legal, the buying of sex is illegal. And there's a lot of research. The one thing Swedes do well is research and study themselves. They have some of the best research in the world. They keep some of the best records you could imagine. And there's some debate about that, but it seems to suggest that it also doesn't, that model doesn't seem to also protect women very well, because if men are afraid of getting arrested, then it's still not above the table. That they have to have shorter times to make negotiations, that they have to go underground. But there's versions of that, of what we have, criminalization of both sides, the Swedish model, and then, for example, the Netherlands model.
I just want to say I appreciate your question, because in some ways I heard you asking our panelists if what they think about the criminalization of sex workers. And in many ways I asked you all to tell me what you might think about a Mexican who can work for Walmart in Mexico, or who chooses to cross the border and work for Walmart in Texas, whether or not that person should be criminalized. And I think one of the points that I'm hearing here is that it seems that when we criminalize these people for making choices within the options that they have, we only push them into the shadows, and they no longer even have the options of the citizens in their nation states to be confident in speaking to authorities about extreme abuse, about extremely horrible things that are taking place. That seems to be what I'm hearing.
Yes.
I have a response to that.
Well, I also, gentleman in the back.
Okay.
Thanks. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you still have to talk loud. Because it's
I
not
certainly will.
taping.
I have no problems doing that. And I wanted to expand upon the question of labor and ask the gentleman and the Assistant U.S. Attorney. There is a movement to decriminalize acts of prostitution and other vice acts among trafficked minors and other trafficked individuals in the sex trades. And you raised the issue of the individual who crosses the border to work at Walmart. And the attorney mentioned the Johns who come in and then they go out the back because they have jobs. And when it comes to labor and undocumented workers crossing the border, we were just watching in the film last night about these men who'd come from Central America and were basically kept as slaves in Florida. And actually there was a successful prosecution of their captors. And the big question to me is that there is no prosecution or sustained effort to prosecute companies that hire undocumented workers, be it Walmart or mostly in the agricultural industry. And the issue is that need for low wages really contributes to the lack of prosecution. It's all pertaining to the economy. I just wanted you to elaborate on your thoughts regarding that specific aspect of labor trafficking.
Sure. I mean, you're raising a good question. You're sort of asking, what I hear is that, in one case, these customers aren't the ones that are primarily targeted by maybe the judicial system and punished in the way that, let's say, employers too aren't the primary targets of the laws, and it's employers who are seeking these super profitable laborers over other labor options that they have in the country. And it seems at various times there have been movements to demand that employers be held accountable for their actions. But in the end, those movements haven't been very successful. And it seems that employers have a lot more power than these workers who we're talking about. And the thrust of the people who are most punished tend to be the undocumented workers. And there are studies that even look at the way our Border Patrol, especially from the 1930s into, let's say, the 1950s, operated, in that during harvest time, when agricultural interests across the Southwest needed workers, the Border Patrol would be lax, would allow people to just freely migrate to and from. But when the harvest season was over, the Border Patrol would come in and INS would come in and start conducting mass raids. And what you have there are studies that suggest that the Border Patrol and our INS are sort of acting as the labor recruiters to this day for these agricultural interests who want these super profitable workers when they need them, and then don't need them when the harvest season is over and begin to deport them. But my sense is that movements that target employers, those are tough movements, and they haven't been as successful in the United States as other movements that end up targeting illegal or unauthorized, undocumented workers, and many of those movements have been more successful.
We should stop. I'm sorry, go ahead. No.
Can I, just quickly, I want to throw back at you just a thought, and that is, when you're looking at sort of labor exploitation, and you talk about whether it be Walmart or any other company for that matter, they may do or engage in acts under the guise of a lawful business enterprise, and they bring money to the economy, and there is a benefit to the economic system as a whole, and so they are looked upon favorably. They are not looked upon as the exploiters, and who has the least favorable perception in that equation? That would be the undocumented worker or the person who is perceived as being here illegally and perceived as being disposable. You can come and go back and forth to Mexico and we don't really care about you, right? It's kind of the opposite in the sex trade. In the sex trade, the people who are looked upon the worst would be the persons engaged in the sex acts themselves or the exploiters of those people. And it's not hard to look upon them, and look down upon them and not really want to rally behind them, because what do they bring to our economic picture, right? The Johns, we had a list, we had a book in the most recent case that we did. We're talking about doctors from the Cleveland Clinic, we're talking about law enforcement, we're talking about professors, we're talking about tradespeople. None of them get looked upon, looked down upon or frowned upon. They're just engaging in something that if they went to Vegas, they could do legally, right? They're just purchasing sex. They're not looked at with a negative eye. And so I'm just throwing back at you the perception and the what can you do for me, what have you done for me lately kind of mentality is very important in how we look at this equation and how we fix it.
Our dilemma is
we're going to come back. Mark, I'm sure your question is going to fit the next session because Mark always brings it together. So, but we want to make sure we give people about 5 minutes. I just want to say by way of closing out this session and making sure that our panelists have any final things they want to say, but just piggybacking off of this conversation right here, one of the things that I'd also like us to think about as we go away and come back, or just, go away if some people can't come back, is what I'm hearing is a really complexity within this conversation of the illicit. I'm also hearing the complexity in the conversation of the legal, which I've said before. One of the things I want us to think about is not only kind of the economic situations, economic opportunity, economic exploitation, but questions of human dignity and respect. I want us to think about all of that in relationship to root causes. But I also want us to take a look at what it is we find it, quote unquote, easier to rally around, and what that means in terms of which systems get disrupted. And how sometimes we can't see the connections between the two. In other words, sometimes we find it easier to rally around the illicit, right, in the most extravagant or extraordinary or, a high-profile cases, and we don't find it as easy or know how to enter or even find, because of the perceptions, the worthiness of organizing or thinking about how we disrupt the legal that John raised, right? And so I want us to kind of think about that too, not only, what we're hearing about the complexity of situations, but what it is we do and how we're motivated and based on perceptions to move or not move for certain groups of people based on what we know, we perceive, and assume about them and about systems, even our own U.S. system, right? So there's a way in which we may not contest or intervene in that because we hold it to a certain standard without being able to question what it means for the majority of people in society. So I'd like us to leave on that note with me, but any final comments that our panelists may have, then we'll take about a 5 or 10 minute bathroom break, eat all that food out there, come back, and we'll get the next session started. Any final? Can we give them a round, please? So please take 5-10 minutes. We still have food out here for you to snack on, bring back in here with you, rejuvenate coffee, and then we'll bring the next group up and get started.
Good morning. This is the second panel for the day, and thanks a lot for coming. Thanks a lot for attending. We're very happy we can have some background music during the panels today. Actually, there are music tryouts going on upstairs. Okay. Yeah. So the second panel focuses a little more on trafficking and from different perspectives. I'm very pleased to have with us Detective Morgan from the FBI Task Force in the Cuyahoga County Sheriff's Office, Ms. Renee Jones from the Renee Jones Empowerment Center, and then her colleague, Rachel. I'm going to go off first, and what I'm trying to do here is transition from the previous panel about modalities of exploitation to talking a little more about trafficking. And what I'm going to be doing is actually presenting some stuff from my own work with some other folks and talking about what we're trying to do and basically trying to learn about trafficking. So before I begin, I just want to thank the Friedman Center here at Case Western, which provided funding for some of this research, and over there, Ann Holstein, Roger Zender. I also want to thank Jove, who's working on some of this project, and then Brian Polk, who's also working on this project. What I'm going to do is talk about exploitation briefly, then talk about human trafficking, and then hopefully take a step where I put it into a bigger picture. I'm a sociologist and a lawyer. I do comparative work on law and social policy, and especially human rights. And then talk about a project that focuses a little more here, Northeast Ohio. My background, a while ago, I started a project on something called a children's ombudsperson. And the interest came out of a federal lawsuit I was following in another state, and just wondered what was happening there. Could it happen in other countries? So I started looking at other countries about this situation. It involved a foster care situation and a federal policy called charitable choice. So I went to other countries, and basically lots of people I talked to in like ministries of social affairs, things like that, said, you should contact our children's ombudsperson. I'd never heard of that office. So I ended up doing that, and I'm trying to finish a book on children's ombudspersons. Children's ombudspersons have, in many countries, have the obligation of ensuring that their government implements the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. These offices are popping up all over the world. So it kind of begged the question of whether these offices were successful in doing what they were supposed to do. Well, there's no real measure out there of children's rights at the international level, so I had this great idea of why don't we do that? That's turned out to be a lot of work. But always in the back of my mind, I have like my mom saying, so why do you do what you do? What good is it? So I'm doing all this academic work, but also struggling to think about, are we going to have an impact? So I went to talk to Ann Victory and Karen Walsh at the Collaborative Initiative. Talked with them, they gave me some ideas, and then I went to see Ms. Jones, who also gave me some ideas. And that's where a lot of this comes from. And then eventually I ended up meeting with members of the FBI Task Force. All right, so in the background in our work, we're thinking about exploitation. And just the idea is unfairly taking advantage of someone's work. And it's much bigger than that, but that's just a simple definition. And what we're trying to do is thinking about this, extending it to groups. So you've heard a lot already, but trafficking affects everyone. Maybe don't notice it, don't sense it, but the different kinds of trafficking out there. Some estimates, as you heard before, it's a huge business. There are patterns in who is trafficked. That's one of the things that we're trying to study. As you also heard, it's tough to monitor, let alone enforce. And then it's not just one type of government that's involved. Especially in a country like the United States, this is federal, state, and local. And then, of course, families are part of this too, because of a member of their family who is being trafficked. So, who cares about trafficking? This is just a brief acknowledgement that there's important work done at the international level by the UN, ILO, in the United States, the FBI, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Justice, Department of Labor. There's a National Human Trafficking Center. There's also nonprofits that I failed to put up there, like Polaris. In Ohio, we have the Ohio Attorney General, the governor, and then locally we have the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor, the Sheriff, the Cleveland Police Department, suburbs, and other cities. And then more locally, we have Ms. Jones here, and I mentioned some other folks, people here in the area who are on the ground providing services and doing other kinds of things. Karen McHenry at Belfair. I mentioned the Collaborative Initiative. Ms. Jones here, the Renee Jones Center. And there are other groups, individuals out there who are doing things to try to help. So how is trafficking defined? This is based on the U.S. Criminal Code. Maybe don't even need to go over it, but the act of compelling or coercing a person's labor, services, or commercial sex acts. The coercion can be subtle or overt, physical or psychological, but it must be used to coerce a victim into performing labor, services, or commercial sex acts. And there's a lot of discussion about this idea. We've talked about last night, this morning, but it's complicated. There's also a UN protocol. And I'm not going to read this, but at the UN, it's a human rights treaty that some governments have ratified. One way to think about trafficking, and this is not mine, this comes from, I think, the United Nations, dividing it up into the act, the means, and the purpose. The act is, for example, recruitment, transport, transfer, harboring, receipt of persons. The means can be, as discussed before, a threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, an abuse of power, giving payments or benefits. And the purpose is exploitation, which can include prostitution, sexual exploitation, forced labor, slavery or similar practices, removal of organs, and there are other types of exploitation. So one part we're working on is at the international level. And part of our work looks at child trafficking. But even child trafficking, this is a dated estimate. And it's one of the things I start off with is it's tough to know. It's just tough to know. It's hidden. People don't want it to come to light. So it's tough to know. And another estimate for the United States is 257 children annually are trafficked. But I think even that we could challenge. At the bottom is a link to the U.S. State Department's reports on trafficking, the trafficking report, trafficking in persons, thank you, which stands for TRIP, which that's the way I always remember it. And so one of the things we're looking at is this U.S. State Department report. And they have 3 tiers where they are watching how governments do in their work on trafficking. Basically, they rank countries according to these tiers. Okay, lots of questions about this work, but it's international. They have nearly every country in there, it's got some information in there that's very useful. Really, just thinking again about efforts to prevent trafficking. And what they actually look at is prevention, prosecution. I'm drawing a blank too. It must be like Rachel said. 4 hours of sleep. There's one more P. Prohibition? Thank you. That's Brian Polk, who is currently saving mine. So, Tier 1 is full compliance with the Trafficking Victims Protection Act's minimum standards. Okay. Second is that the government is making significant efforts. 2WL means there's a watch list. So there's making significant efforts, but there are major problems. And it can be, for example, they know that the government is making efforts, but they also know that there are significant problems in that country in terms of trafficking. The third is that they're not making significant efforts to comply fully. So in 2013, there were 30 countries that got a Tier 1, 92 at 2, 44 at 2.5, or the watch list. 3 are 21. I just gave you some examples. It's not I mean, for the most part, the wealthy OECD countries are in Tier 1. Okay. Tier 2, though, all over the world. It's not like you can just you look at it and say there's definitely a pattern there. There are no patterns that we can really see on the top of it. Robin Shura, who's a professor at Hiram College, Brian and I are examining explanations of efforts to reduce trafficking in persons and looking at these tiers. And it's very early on, but one of the things that we found is that, statistically, and remember that statistically, which really just shows there's a relationship. It may not be a real relationship. But we have a measure of government corruption. And boy, is there a strong relationship. That doesn't tell us, we talked a lot in the previous panel about the demand, to use the economist term. But why is this happening in different countries? But this hints that it's a government that is not protecting people's rights, enforcing people's rights, that probably is not democratically accountable, that there are issues there. Make sense? Okay. Going more locally in the United States, also a tough thing to measure here in the United States. This is one report, I believe, from the U.S. Department of Justice that gives a snapshot of different kinds of trafficking in the United States and tells us about different aspects of trafficking. Okay? So you can see with this study, the ratio of female to male trafficking victims, it's almost a 1 to 10 ratio. More locally, Jove and I are working on a project here to get to know trafficking in Northeast Ohio. And so this is a report that just looks at different aspects of trafficking by city. And I would be cautious with this information, as with all this information, just because how hard it is to study trafficking. But this looks at a couple of the cities in Ohio, the bigger cities, Cincinnati, Dayton, Columbus, Cleveland, Toledo, and looks at different aspects. So, for example, a victim who first became involved under the age of 18, adults forced into the sex trade. And what you can see, it's not, there's some bumps there. So Cleveland, for example, comes out high in adults forced into the sex trade, for example. Make sense? So it's not like it's the same everywhere, if these estimates are right. So Jove and I are working on what we call the local project. And what we want to do is identify networks of trafficking, as well as identify gaps. And that'll make sense in a moment. We're trying to figure out where services are provided to trafficking victims, and then how services are provided to them. Our approach is working with something called Backpage. How many people are familiar with Backpage? Okay. So how to describe Backpage? I'm sure you'll talk more about it. Backpage is like Craigslist. If you've ever used Craigslist, you can buy a car, a refrigerator, you can sell a car. Backpage also has some of those things, but also has adult services. And so Jove and I have gone to Backpage, and I think it was actually after meeting with the FBI task force where they suggested, take a look at this. We've gone to that website to try to gather information. It's almost like eBay. People post something like, I'm selling this shirt, but they're adult services. So people put up like telephone numbers, services they provide. Detective Morgan probably will talk more about it. We also are looking at law enforcement reports. Want to get to know more about the service providers. Get to know the idea of the Johns. Agree, that's not a great name, John. And then we're working with the Friedman Center here at Case Western on mapping software. So Backpage, you can pick a city, you pick the state, you pick the city, and then you can pick the service that you want. Just real quickly, Jove and I started working on this. We decided we had this spreadsheet set up, and we're going to take turns. I went first. I got up at 6 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, I think it was a Saturday, and started entering information in. Like, I'll do Saturday, he's going to do Sunday, I'll do Monday. We're going to do it like that. So from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., I was entering stuff in. I'm like, all right, done. And then it refreshed itself and like more than doubled everything that was in there. I was like, oh crap, like this is going to be impossible. And then Joe had the same experience. It was like, this is unbelievable. I was going to put something up there, but I'm not comfortable doing it. This is I guess it doesn't really come out very clear. This is what their website looks like. So you go to adult right there, you can see escorts, body rubs, strippers, etc. What we've done is taken these ads and try to gather geographic information. And what the geographic information is what where the person says they're willing to go. So I should be clear, this is not necessarily trafficking. These are these ads under adult escorts. Okay? What we want to try to find first is just patterns, okay, using this software. And then work with law enforcement agencies and others to figure out what's going on. So this is by the age, but it's a stated age in the ad, which may be completely fabricated. Then some? Good chance of that? Okay. So what do we know? What we're trying to do, as I mentioned, is get data also from law enforcement agencies and put it in the spreadsheet and basically match where these people are saying they are going and where law enforcement. And what we wonder, because so much is electronic, is whether they modify their behavior in response to where law enforcement is. I think Detective Morgan can tell us more about that and what they do in response. As I mentioned, we're also trying to work with service providers on this too. Okay. So what we're trying to do moving forward is work with a bunch of different data points and work on a variety of types of maps. What we're trying to do, again, is capture this idea of what trafficking is, where it's happening. For the most part, from our work, as you can see, we're focusing on sex trafficking here in Northeast Ohio. It's not because we're not interested in labor trafficking, it's because we're having a harder time. If you go for that category of sex versus labor trafficking, arguably they all fall under one umbrella. What we can find more easily is information about sex trafficking. Thank you. Ms. Jones, do you want to go? Yeah. So our next speaker is Ms. Renee Jones from the Renee Jones Center here in Cleveland, Ohio. Very glad to have you.
Good afternoon. My name is Renee Jones, and I am very happy to be here because I'm always happy to have the opportunity to share what's happening at the grassroots level. The Renee Jones Empowerment Center is located on the near west side in the Detroit Shoreway area. And in 2008, we started a program called Project Red Cord. And the program was started to reach out to women in the commercial sex industry and give them another opportunity. Because as you heard today from the prosecutors and the panel that was before us, all of the time, just putting people in jail is not solving the problem because they continually see the same people before them. To me, that signals they need some help. And we need to provide that service for them. So in 2008, the program was created for that reason. However, it didn't go the way that we thought it would go. Because I thought that everybody would be open to this program. And I would go to local meetings and talk about when there were stings in the area, instead of putting those women in jail, let us have them in our program. And the response that I would get is that those women don't want anything. They want to be out there. And I was like, wow, I can't believe people think like that. So I continued to go. I became their worst nightmare because that really became my driving force to be able to be a voice for those women. Now, can we save everyone? No. There are going to be some people that you encounter that no matter what you present before them, they're not going to take advantage of it. However, the ones that do makes it all worth it. And to me, that is the driving force behind what we do. And as we began to talk about the program and we weren't getting the results we wanted, we began to go do our own outreach and we began to go to the streets. And when we went to the street, that's when I got a real good view of what was really happening. We seen girls and women out there from all over, from every suburb. It's not an inner city issue, because sometimes people think, oh, this only happens in the inner city, in the bad neighborhoods. I can tell you pretty much, I don't think it's one suburb that I have not seen a woman or a girl from. And that's scary. So I like to tell people, trafficking doesn't discriminate. It's everywhere. And these traffickers are so slick. I mean, every time you find a way, they'll find a different way. It is a huge business, and they don't care about the women or the girls that they're exploiting. And so when we started doing this outreach, we began to come across these women. And I'll never forget the very first woman. I was going to actually bring her today, but I knew we only had a few minutes, and we had to wind her in. But she was one of the first women that went to our local councilman's office one night when we were open and demanded some help. She said, I need help. And then they remembered that program then. We had 15 minutes before closing. And they said, I seen their number on the phone on the caller ID. And I was like, wow, what are they calling so late for? And it was this very woman. And we always celebrate her. Her name's Paulette, because she was the very first woman that was enrolled in Project Red Cord. And today, Paulette is instrumental in helping to save some of these young girls' lives by sharing her experience with them and what she's been through, which is really important. So that's how the program started. And since 2010, the FBI task force was formed. Did I get that right? And then I met up with the task force, and that was great. And I can tell you, if you don't know, and I had never worked with law enforcement before on anything that we did, but I'm gonna tell you right now, we should be very grateful for law enforcement. Because when I see those girls that come in, I think of them as my daughter. It could be your sister, it could be your aunt, and even today we have lots of young grandmothers. So we're seeing a gamut of young women and girls who are not just somebody's daughter, they're somebody's mother, they're somebody's sister. So that is how we approach the way that we work with these women, because they have been manipulated to believe that this person who is exploiting them is somebody good for them. And it's our job to help restore them back to really good thinking, to let them know that somebody cares about them, to provide them the supports they need to be successful. Because this is not like one program where you can go in and get 6 counseling sessions, you're good to go. Oh no, this doesn't work like that. This is lifelong. This is like, I call it the new AA. These victims and survivors have to have support forever. They are going to have to be connected to a positive source that is going to keep them on the right track. Because this manipulation, it's really hard for you to get your hands around, even grasp why you would want to go back to someone who has done these horrible things to you. But it's a process, and it's very effective. I had one girl we worked with over a year, doing great, doing all kind of great things. But you know what? It was still that little connection that ended up pulling her back out there. So that's always a risk. People say, well, what's your recovery? What's your success rate? Hey, we go day by day. You can't guarantee anything, because they can always be at risk of going back out there. And what we're seeing now is a lot of this heroin, where these girls are coming in, they're addicted to this heroin. If you've ever seen that, if you need to see what somebody looks like in need of heroin. The first time I experienced that, I was so scared. I didn't want that girl to die in the center. And when I seen that, that just made me so much more determined that we have to fight. We have to do whatever we can, and everybody has to get involved. Because you heard the prosecutors, it's a hard job trying to prosecute these cases. They are telling the truth, because these women and the girls that go through it, if you can't get them recovered enough or feeling confident enough to know that they should testify against this horrible person, so they can't continue to do it to other people. But it's really a hard thing to do. So what we've done that's been very effective is lately we've gotten a barrage of parents who are concerned about their teenagers who have access to all this technology, which can be wonderful, but can also be detrimental. Because some of the parents are not computer or savvy. They don't know all these different softwares. And these kids are meeting strangers, having sex with total strangers through social media. And it's happening, it's like an epidemic. I'm like, every day I get in, I promise you, every day I arrive at the center, I got a couple of messages. So the parents are seeking out resources. So when I started getting these calls, I'm like, wow, this is something. But we need to do something because they can be prime victims to be trafficked because of their behaviors, those risky behaviors, getting online, connecting with people you've never seen, meeting people. And everybody in this room is pretty computer savvy, right? So if you never met me and you've been sharing emails together, eventually you're like, oh yeah, that's Renee. You feel like you know me. I feel like I know you. Well, that's how these kids are doing. Because to be a teen today is very difficult. They have more pressures than you would ever imagine that we ever had. When I grew up, we had a house phone. And your mother answered it. So she pretty much knew who you were talking to. I've seen kids who are 10 and under with cell phones, with voicemail. You don't know who they're talking to. Their parents ain't listening to their messages. Computers in their bedrooms. Kids sexting pictures of themselves right out of their bedroom, being trafficked and being brought home. And I got a case right now where I'm sure that girl is being trafficked. I told her mother, I was like, you set your clock, you get up every hour on the hour and you go in there and make sure she's in that room. You put another bolt on that door, something where you can hear. Because she will find her outside in the middle of the night. What's she doing outside at 5 o'clock? Somebody just dropped her off. So educating the parents is key. So what we have done, since all this time has been going on, we've started to use survivors to empower these young girls. Because it's kind of scary seeing all these girls getting hooked up, meeting strangers. I mean, I just couldn't imagine it. One girl, a man came from Canada to meet her. And he came to her house because they're putting their house information on there. Come pick me up. I'm like, oh man, she bringing them to her house? That's how confident they are. Because they feel like they have a relationship. And they're looking for love, but it's in all the wrong places. So what we try to do is provide that love and support and to make sure that we're there, but we deal with it head on. When the parents come in, I just tell the parents, listen, your daughter needs to be in this group with some survivors. And you can't be all that protective because you're going to save her life. Because if you keep the way she's going right now, one day you might look for her and somebody would have taken her and you wouldn't know where she is. So it is a reality that we see every day. When we leave here, we got a group. Because they're in need and no matter what, I don't care if it's a blizzard or whatever, it's their lifeline. So we have to keep it going. And that's part of the work that we do. And I brought a survivor because I think it's very important. We can do studies, we can give statistics, we can do all that. But when you hear from a person who has experienced it, we can learn a lot from that. And that's what we try to do. So we try to be innovative and creative with, like these kids, they love dating and meeting people. So the next new thing we got is speed. You ever heard of speed dating? We got speed mentoring. And they're like so excited about it. You got to get them with the stuff they like. And the technology, whatever it is, if it's out of the box, we gonna do it. If it's gonna save their lives, we gonna try it. So they're kind of excited about this. It's like, I say, speed dating, how you meet this guy, you got to use what they like. But only we're going to take it and put some powerful people that they can be mentored by to speak life into their lives. Because they have, like the prosecutor said, he treats me better than anybody else has treated me. And sometimes these kids at home got a lot of things going on. So it's really easy for them to connect with someone. So that's really our work. And part of our other outreach is strip club outreach. And we've been doing that for about 2 years. And that's powerful. It's one of my favorite things to do. And when we went to the strip clubs, people said, "You going to a strip club?" And I was like, yeah. Because if we're going to deal with the issue, we have to deal with the root of how people get connected. The reason why we go there, because a lot of these girls are going there sometimes just to make extra money. You'd be surprised who's in there. You'd be surprised who's in there. People who sending their kids to college, all kind of people are in there. And all shapes and sizes too, because I used to think strippers is going to be like a, size 3 or something. No, they got any kind of size, any kind of color, nationality that you want is in there. It was an eye-opener for me. But when we went there, we didn't know how we were going to be received. I didn't really know what I was going to do, how it was going to work. But we found a way to get in on a Valentine's Day by meeting a guard, armed guard, standing at the door, asking him, would he mind taking in these gifts that we have for the ladies? And he was like, really? And that was the beginning of the one club, which was a little bitty club that has a little bitty parking lot with just a few cars in it. We gave out about 5 bags, thinking this place cannot have more than 5 girls in there dancing. Then within a couple minutes, these girls, they're running out like little kids, with the bags, screaming, "Oh, this kid, oh, it's Valentine's Day." And then the guard says, "Well, ma'am, you didn't have enough bags." He said, "They have 17 girls." And I'm thinking, 17 girls in this little place with 2 or 3 cars here? So that told me something. I said, "Oh, yeah, we got plenty." We had 20. And it was, thank God, we had 20 to be able to supply them. So over time, we just built a relationship. The bag was our success and key because the bag will be tailored to any holiday. I don't care if it's Flag Day, any holiday I can find on that calendar. We're going to decorate that bag and put things in there that make them feel beautiful. And our team writes notes. And we have a specific team that's trained. Because one thing we learned right up top, everybody can't do that. You got to be able to talk to somebody that's practically naked and not be like, "Oh my God." You can't be doing none of that. So we walk in, it's like they half naked, they doing lap dances, and it's so powerful that we learned different things and techniques, but we had gotten to the place where one day we came in and the DJ's like, "Guess who's in the house?" I was like, And they were like, "The Renee Jones Empowerment." The people were like, "Yes." I was like, wow. I thought that was so cool. And I was like, that's great. So the women were like, I said, "Okay, now we got to go straight to the dance, to the dressing room." Because they had showed us all the ins and outs. Until one day, there was this is a little tiny club. They got a lot of little secret places. Then I was like, okay, we can't go into all these secret places, so we don't want to get crammed up in there. So I said, we're going to go there. But one day, one of the ladies, she wasn't in the room, and the women want to make sure that she got the bag. And they said, "Well, where's Mary? She's not here. Where is she?" I said, "Well, where is she?" She said, "We'll take you." And they took us to this little room. And I was like, oh my God, it had like a full-fledged bar, little bitty place. And Mary's in there giving a lap dance in full force. She never stopped. We're like, "Hey, Mary, hold up your hand." Sister Cecilia, she's on the team. So me, this man, I thought he was going to pass out cold because he did not expect us to be in there. But it was powerful. That meant something to her. So we do that because that is where these girls can be sold. It's where they're recruited. And a lot of times it is where they innocently get picked up. So just to share, that's part of it. So I brought Rachel because I just want to share. I really want you to hear from her. You want me to ask you questions?
Yeah, you can.
Start off talking about what happened to you.
Hi, Rachel. I was taken when I was 16, and my pimp played as my boyfriend, and to hide me away, he took me to a truck stop off the Niles exit, the 76 truck stop in Youngstown, and he worked me there until the police got super hot, meaning that a serial killer was out there in the 80s, and the truck driver was dropping the girls off on the side of the highway. And then he took me he crossed me over the state lines in the city of New York. And he turned me out on the streets of New York in Manhattan on 29th Street and 28th Street between 11th and 12th Avenue. My mom and dad didn't see me until I was, for 5 years, till I was 21. The way they seen me was Geraldo Rivera put on a nationwide broadcast of teenage runaways that end up in the streets of New York, and they seen me on TV. And they called New York, and they told them that I was only 17. So by that time, I was already brainwashed. When they say that it's a hard case to deal with, yeah. They sent me home, and I left right back out to go be with my pimp. When I would go to jail, I would do any and everything to protect him. I was doing it for me when the police would ask me. Because also my pimp would drill in my head, you will never stay in jail forever. You will get out, and I will bond you out. He would send somebody else there to bond. He would never come up and bond me out. He would send his sister, a friend, or someone to come get me out of jail. But I was always bonded out. If I didn't have a bail, I would never worry because I know that I would never stay in there forever on a prostitution charge. So I would protect him for everything. Then he finally forced me, back in that time, it was called freebasing cocaine. He forced me to either get high or get beat up. So I didn't think, I said, well, how bad could it be? So I took a hit. And then that's when I got hooked on cocaine, smoking cocaine. And that set my habit off. And he controlled me that way. But I would never disrespect him and go off on ventures and go get high on my own because I feared him that much. And I would be so scared that I would get found out about or anything. I would always wait until he gave it to me. And he would make me suffer about my drug addiction because it would only be like a hit and that would be it.
So what kind of help, I mean, just thinking about the panels and what we heard so far, what kind of help was available for you?
There was none. Back in my time, none. And the police was so, no disrespect to you. The police was so mean to us prostitutes back, especially New York police. And I used to have to do a Jersey sergeant just so that I could work in the state of New Jersey. And he let me have full, what do you call it? Full, yeah, to do what I wanted on that track. I made a track. out of Tennessee Avenue. And he let me work there like anytime I wanted, just as long as I did him. But there was no help. If Austin Town Police had me when I was 16, but I had a false name and a social security number to back that name up. And if they was just a little bit nicer to me, if they was nice to me because I was so green and young, they could have got me and I would have went back home. But just by the way they treated me, I just went with the flow.
So when you think about the challenges that prosecutors face trying to prosecute a case of a pimp or a trafficker that's exploited a young girl, because now you see in our center how we have these young girls, and you see that it's quite different from your time
Right.
of what they're encountering. What do you see that's very different?
I see that really in the prostitution and pimp part, it really hasn't changed that much, because from hearing her say that it's a hard case, they're not really. I mean, if they get that main girl and she's like pushing them back and pushing them away, it's gonna be like that unless they get that weak girl that's like scared of the judicial system and scared of time, that where that pimp didn't embed it in her head, like, don't be scared of the law, you know, you're not gonna face no time and this and that. If he didn't coach her on that, then it's gonna be a lost cause. Because I used to play like, yeah, I'll straighten my life out, you know, I'll do this, I'll do that. And then when I got what I wanted, I was like right back to him. You know, I played those games. Just like with my mom and dad, it's like I would come home for a minute and then, yeah, it's the fact of also when us knowing that we used to have that. I mean, even now, I've been off the streets for 15 years, 15 years clean off drugs, 15 years off the street. And sometimes even now, but it's not gonna make me say, oh, I gotta go out in the street and I gotta go sell myself and this and that. But sometimes it's like, I'll flash back and it's like, I remember when I just used to have all that money and I used to just be able to have that money at hand, you know, and I'd miss it, you know.
Okay. So what has kept you clean and sober and on the right track for these 15 years?
Coming to you, I have such bad trauma, and anybody who has trauma also, you have to feed your trauma. Because if you don't feed your trauma what it needs, it's going to explode. Just like you have to give your recovery of drugs what it needs, you have to also give your trauma what it needs. And if you don't give your trauma what it needs, it's going to cause you to go out and get high. It's a big circle. I'm gonna have to stay in the healing process for the rest of my life for the things that I've been through, because I've been beat, raped numerous times, a lot of times, tied up and tortured, cut, I mean, just beat down. And I'm not saying that to be sympathized on, and I'm just saying it just so that you're aware of some of the things that goes on. And just from my daughters grabbing my hand, my pimp used to do that all the time, and I get such a bad reaction that I will fling my arm from my own daughters, you know, and I'll want to say, get the F off me. And it's nothing, and I don't mean that, because that's my child. And it's just a flashback from him just constantly grabbing my hand. And that's something that I still have to work on till this day.
What would you, how are we doing on time? I don't want to keep going. Okay, because I think it's important for people to know these things. When you think about, right now we have the young girls who are coming into the center who have not necessarily been trafficked, but they have risky behaviors, like, you know, sending nude pictures of themselves to total strangers, connecting with people through social media. What have you seen as the impact of having those young women in the survivors support group?
I told a story to a young girl that changed, and I impacted her life, and I changed her life. I broke her down, and this.
What does break? Tell them what break.
I caused her to cry, and it really impacted her to the point where she changed her life. And when she had to go to court, she brought my name up to the judge that I changed her life. And another one, I empower her because she thinks that, well, she relates with me because I have twin girls.
So, because I think it's very powerful to see that, you know, even though you've been through something and you're still recovering and still struggling in other areas, that what you've been through is able to hopefully protect some of these young girls who have these behaviors that can put them in that vulnerable state. So I think that's important.
Yeah.
What is it that you think parents, are there any parents in the room? What would you say to parents, knowing what you see every day, knowing what we see in the center, what these kids are struggling with? What would you say that you wish?
I say this to every time I give my speech of my story. But fathers, if you have daughters, even sons, because they have a host role out in Pittsburgh for boys, and it's called Strawberry Lane. It's behind a hotel. And even though they're not gay, they still sell their body. But fathers, love your daughters and love them hard and let them know, because that's how I got lured to this guy, because I always wanted my dad's approval, and he just didn't give me enough attention. And I love my dad till this day. I mean, I love him, you know, and I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, it's because of my family's fault, and they didn't give me this, or they didn't do this, but, you know, they did the best they could at that time, you know what I mean? But just love your daughters.
And seeing that the time is a little bit different, and parents, I mean, kids now, they have cell phones, they have tablets, they have, you know, the internet and all this other stuff, and they know way more than most parents do about these different social networks that they can meet people on. What would you say?
Even if, you know what I do with my daughters now? I find little things, even videos. If you have to, say your love. I know this might sound corny. Say your love through the video, and that's how I tell them, and they'll appreciate that too.
And I think too, the protection of, because I always like to say this in a group of parents, you know, stop giving them all this privacy.
Yeah.
You are a parent. When parents come into our center, I tell them, I'm one of them old school parents. That's why you're a parent. You are not their best friend. You're not their buddy. You know, you are in that position of authority that you are given to them. They're gifts. Your children are gifts. And if you just let them have things, because I see a lot of parents think they got all these shoes, you know, clothes, and you know, they got all that, but they don't need all that. That's nice if you can do it, but don't give them all that. Don't give them too much. You know, make them earn stuff. Don't give them too much like that. And then give them yourself. sit down and talk with them. Let them know how you feel about them, because if you don't do it, that's why they connected. That's why these girls are going. Most of them, and they come from all different places. Some where the parents ain't giving them nothing, and some where the parents give them everything. They come in there, they got more stuff than you. You know, and you've been working for years. I'm like, where'd you get that from? I'm like, oh, my mother gave me that. I'm like, I've been waiting for 10 years to get that. You know, and it's because they give them all that. But really, what they need, they're not getting. If you have a computer, I'm like, get that computer out their bedroom. That's serious about that. That computer should be in a very central location where everybody walking past. You need to let them know, if I see anything on there that I shouldn't see, you are not going to be on the internet here. You got to be, I mean, it's that bad. And I'll tell parents, when you let them, we got a girl right now, she got a computer in a school, it's a school computer. You know, and mother say, well, you know, when I go in there, you know, I notice she don't have clothes on. That's right, she been filming herself. What else do you need me to tell you? She's naked online. I don't hold back because you're gonna save their lives. She thinks that is the way that someone is going to like her. She is crying out for some attention. Unfortunately, it's the wrong attention. So, you know, I will tell parents that when they're young like that, you need to learn about these get on there and learn about it, read about it. You should have their password. I got a niece. I didn't care. One day I couldn't get on her page. I said, you got 10 minutes to make sure I can get on your page or you getting shut down. She was like, wow. She thought, because they think they know all these little savvy things. I could only see certain things. She had changed all of that. I said, honey, I got all that down. I said, I didn't see that post. You need to make sure I can see it. Because there's nothing you should be posting that should be that secretive. You see? And it sounds hard, but you saving their lives. I'm telling you, the stuff I be seeing, I'm like, that little parenting where you just like, oh, here's your laptop, here's your tablet, just go have everything you need. They on there doing everything, sending naked pictures of themselves, and somebody could be making porn. Your child picture be all over the world somewhere. You see? And I be telling these parents, when a parent come in to me, I'm like, if you're not ready to hear the truth, this ain't the right place for you. I'm like, we take the full everything off. This is what they're doing. I'm like, you get in there, you alarm your clock, you a hard sleeper. She's a hard sleeper. She's sneaking out every time you sleep. And, you know, and then you catch her outside. She's like, I'm smoking. First of all, you're too young to be smoking like that. A chain smoker, you're only a kid. I said, I said, if you can't wake up, set your clock. Every hour you go in there and you do a bed check. She better be in that bed. And she better be fully dressed. You let her know, just be on her constantly. She was like, Miss Jones. I said, that's right, bed check. Because I tell them, I don't even try to hide it from them. We meet with the parent as well as the kid. We do one-on-ones with the kid and we do one-on-ones with the parent. Because I'm telling them, you better know how to fight this demon. Because this is something that will take your child's life and destroy it. And when they can come into the group, and I think the very first young girl that we put into the group, this young girl had met a man had came from Canada, a grown man who was married, to meet this little girl. Came to her house, and she put all the information on there. He came right to her house, picked her up, took her somewhere, had sex with her and everything, and took her to Wendy's. You see what I'm saying? Because she's just a kid. She wanted to single. It was a surprise. You see what I'm saying? See, they don't want nothing. You see, so you'll be thinking it's a lot. Say, oh, they got to get $1,000. No, he took me to Wendy's. You know, it's the little stuff because there's still that kid in them. You see what I'm saying? So I'll be telling the parent, I'm like, you got to be paying attention. If they come in, if they're not outgoing, if they've been outgoing, all of a sudden they isolated. They just stand and they don't have no friends. All the signals, all the signs are like right there. And I remember we just tested this out. Some stuff, I don't have a clue if it's going to work, but I'm willing to try it to see if it's going to save them. So one day I took this girl and I told her mother, I said, you guys, this is something serious right here. Because after she got caught, even by law enforcement, it didn't stop her. She was still meeting. Different ones was coming. Luckily, nothing happened to her where she was killed. But I told her mother, she gonna be dead. Somebody gonna kill her. I be telling them just like that. You're dealing with, you don't know who these people, if a person would come from another country and pick up your child at your house, that's what's out here. You know, And I told him, you got to know that. You got to be that serious. And I took that girl, and I didn't know how she was going to react, but I told her mother, I said, I want your permission, because this adult group, we talk about all kind of stuff. This is raw. And I said, but I think she needs to be in there. And the first day I put her in there, then I was like, oh my God, I might have made a mistake. I thought she was going to pass out. She was like, she was just wailing and wailing. I mean, she was so, but that thing, that helped her. And I went to court with her, and her judge had no mercy on her, because she's sick of seeing all these girls coming in there with these charges, not knowing what dangers there. So the judge wouldn't even talk. She had a great judge. I was like, get her, judge, because that was good, because her mother couldn't help her. She needed to know, you're going to have to be accountable. That judge was not talking to that mother. That judge was talking to her. And saying, and then she stood up and she started talking about, she was like, I know I did some foolish things, but I've learned. And that very girl, we used her to get another girl who we suspect is being trafficked, whose mother came into our center one night when we were just having a meeting. She just stopped in and she heard about us and said, I'm really concerned about my daughter. And I said, well, we're going to use her to call your daughter. I said, give us your daughter's phone number. And I told that young girl, you give her a call and you invite her here. We don't need to do it. That's how you do it. And then she invited her. Now she loves to come. She might fight with her mother, but she's like, I got to get to that group. And that's the power of taking these experiences and sharing it, where these women can tell them, they might think I'm smoking a blunt. Hey, I'm just me and him hanging out. No, but that's the gateway to something else. They're going to have you hooked on heroin, and then you're going to be subject to that addiction, and you're going to be doing whatever they tell you to do. So it's really powerful. If you have kids, look at those internet. If you have nieces and stuff like that, look at it. Make sure that you are aware. Don't just assume they know. Okay?
The sex industry and the pleasure industry, because they seem to me to get conflated, but they seem to me to be different. So if someone could explain to me, and I guess the question was not only triggered by some of the presentation, but Detective Morgan, one of the things that you said is, with the pleasure industry, if they want to do that, it's part of that kind of undiagnosed mental space. So I'm wondering, then how we tie people who want to engage.
I said that when we were talking to some of these young ladies, that it appeared to be some undiagnosed mental issues that they're having, because they don't have health insurance.
Oh, I see. Okay.
They have a mental problem. It could be bipolar disorder. It could be some disorder like that compulses them into, because some of these girls that I have talked to like doing it. They don't have a pimp.
Right.
They have jobs.
Right.
But they still escort.
So I better understand what you're saying. But I guess my question still stands though, because are in those cases where you actually find out there is a diagnosis, that's one thing. But what about people who for real, like doing it, and they're not bipolar, they're not anything? I mean, they have agency and they like doing it. They like engaging in the pleasure industry. So what are the how do we unpack that so that we're kind of understanding that a little bit better? But what are these different definitions legally? I mean, how?
I don't think there's a difference in definition. I think it's just how some people like to refer to it. I've used the term, I don't like to use the term prostitution, I like to use the term escorting. It's the same thing.
And that's the same as trafficking? And the same as?
No.
Okay, so how?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
And first and foremost, there are places where it is legal for a person to consensually engage in a sex act in exchange for money. Not here, but there are places where that is lawful. The primary difference between prostitution and trafficking is one requires a showing of force, fraud, or coercion, and that's trafficking. That means that there is some level of force or some type of coercion or something that is put upon somebody else to engage in something that they would not have willfully engaged in on their own. It's a mechanism of control. Generally, you will see a prostitution charge either where there is no one else involved in engaging in putting them out there, whether that be on the street or whether that be on the internet. And it is somebody who is placing themselves in that situation for whatever reason. We don't need to get into that, but placing themselves in that situation and accepting money in exchange for a sexual act. It is illegal in the state of Ohio, no matter where you are in the state of Ohio, both to engage in sex for money. Even though you can have consensual sex at the age of 16 on for free, or for dinner, or for a hotel room, or whatever the case may be. So that's the primary difference, is this coercion element or this force element, that you are being in some way manipulated or forced to engage in an act that you would not otherwise engage in, that is for money or some type of remuneration.
And in Ohio, we don't have commercial sex industry that's above ground because there's no such thing of it being legal in Ohio.
Correct.
So those who want to willfully engage in, sexual exploration in terms of, remuneration of various kinds automatically are shifted into the illegal category.
Right.
Right?
I'd like to address this to prosecutor and maybe Ms. Jones, relevant to the anonymity of the demand and commercial buyer. Is it in terms of vigorous prosecution? The Assistant Attorney General indicated that she had a litany of individuals who were very prominent within this community and so forth. It appears, correct me if I'm wrong, there's not a vigorous or tenacious prosecution or apprehension of these individuals, and the penalties are minimized. As she's indicated when she was in the city of Cleveland as the law department, that the emphasis is on the other aspects of it. So I'm wondering, is this relevant to the phenotype and the demographic or the affluence of the commercial buyer and the demand, that they have not been emphasized in terms of nullifying or trying to negate that? Not saying that it's a placebo to do such, but I'm just trying to figure out, it seems that there is a marginalization of that particular equation in terms of the commercial buyer, who they are, their families, whether they're clergy, professors, physicians, law enforcement. As the young lady said, that she was even a sergeant within New Jersey, allowed her to freely do this as long as she was able to provide services. Now, I'm trying to figure out how pervasive is this, and is there a animus in terms of vigorous enforcement and ad hominem enforcement of that in terms of prosecution? No, saying not and qualifying and saying it's not a placebo, and I'm just trying to figure out why is it so this anonymity, about this. We talk about the horrific issues of turns one out on heroin, but all these things are contingent upon the commercial buyer and the demand. So I'm trying to figure out where is the vigorous prosecution, where's the vigorous interdiction on that aspect?
I will have a comment after you guys talk about what it's like in Illinois, because they've done a lot of different things on that side for in demand.
I think that's an excellent question. I know that there was a period of time where in the city of Cleveland, through the municipal court, they would run something on public television where they would list the Johns that were arrested. I know that they were confiscating or towing cars and forfeiting cars of Johns who were coming to engage in street level sales and street level prostitution. So there was sort of a public shaming that went with being arrested for purchasing sex. I don't know if that's I don't know.
I'm talking about risk rewards. I'm talking about like for trafficking, you can get, like you said, you can get a mandatory. There's mandatory minimums.
Right.
There's no mandatory minimum from what I've seen. There's just a first degree misdemeanor, or 5-level misdemeanor.
Right. And
there's no first. It's not a first degree felony.
And that's the next thing.
Second degree felony.
The next thing that I was going to talk about is that that the focus in both law enforcement and prosecution in terms of how we spend our resources is on the individuals who are trafficking. That's the primary place where we focus our resources. And if you look at the model, it's kind of like trying to fight drug crimes. It would be like trying to stop engage in a war on drug by prosecuting everybody who is a street level user to try to dry up the demand for drugs. And, it's like pruning a rose bush. There's always going to be another rose that grows. That didn't work. The war on drugs didn't work by fighting from the bottom up, and I don't suspect you're going to dry up the sex industry and the trafficking of individuals by the prosecution of purchasers, because frankly, they'll just keep coming. I think the focus and the target for our resources, which are sadly very limited, is to try to go from the top down and prosecute those people who are putting out the force, engaging in the threats or the violence or the manipulation or the distribution of drugs or the luring of young girls or women or boys into the trade. I think that's where the focus is truly at because of resources. I don't think we have, and you're right, there are no felony offenses for the purchase of sexual act, for commercial sex acts. At best, it is a first-degree misdemeanor to purchase a commercial sex act.
I got one last question in less than 10 seconds. Okay. Is it because they're white?
10 seconds.
Is it because they're white and rich? Because a lot of these Johns are white, rich, or black, or happen to be professionals.
That has absolutely nothing to do with it.
Okay, well, could you elaborate on that?
Yes, we've done John operations on the streets of Lorraine, and every one, we did it, and what's happened is that these girls and these guys know exactly when Vice works and when they don't work. So we scheduled one for Saturday morning, and by the time we started at 9 o'clock, by noon, the paddy wagon was full, and not one person on there was from the city of Cleveland. They were all from the suburbs, and they were all white. Okay, and they were all charged, and their cars were towed. Okay, so I hate when people bring that up about there's a demographic or there's a discrimination, because there's no discrimination in this problem. Okay, this is a human problem. This isn't a black problem. It's not a white problem. This is a problem for everyone. And there's black men, there's white men, there's Asian men, there's all kind of men that demand sex. Okay. Some of these girls, when they post something, and they post a new ad on Backpage, in 2 minutes they already got 10 calls. All because their ad said new to Backpage. And it could be a black girl, could be a white girl, could be an Asian girl. Okay? No problem.
I can answer a little bit too. As I said before, In Demand, Illinois is very strong. So in 2005, the city of Chicago decided, and you can just Google prostitution in Chicago, it will come up. They put mugshots of every man who's arrested for prostitution-related offense on websites, along with their names, their address to the city block, their age, their race, which is not their race, but their picture, where the prostitution was, and if their car was impounded. I've done some interesting research that you can find on the internet that tracked who these men are who are being arrested. Now, these men who were arrested in street level vice, like stings, these were intentional when they were going out just to arrest men. If you look though at the charges of, you're asking like who's being charged, when it's not a sting, and you have a buyer and a seller, most often that's a woman selling and a man buying. You can look at the charges and show as the felony, now it's a felony to a second offense in Illinois to buy sex. 2 men were arrested under that felony charge in the last 2 years. So when it's on the street, and it's not a sting, they're arresting the woman. When they have the stings where it's purposely to go out and use resources to pick up Johns, then they will arrest those Johns and then post those pictures online. And I can tell you disproportionately, those are, I think, from the study that I did, 60% were African American men, 30% were Hispanic, and actually 10% were transgender, men presenting as women in the pictures. And that's because biologically their license said that they were men, although they were presenting as women, would consider themselves women, and were being arrested for a prostitution charge because they were selling, but being arrested as buyers because they're men. Does that make sense? They only put men online because men are the only ones who could buy. So 10% of all those mugshots are actually transgenders being arrested and posted online. So those are some of the ways in Illinois that you can see where that in-demand stuff is showing up.
But then that would give, we got some questions out here, but that scenario that you just painted would give me the sense that it's primarily an issue of people of color buying.
No, it's
or
it's
selling,
street level.
or, okay.
It's street level vice things in certain neighborhoods.
Right, but that would give me the
Yes.
perception and the picture that that's who's buying. And I think that gets back to Mark's question, gets back to your response, Detective. I mean, there's perception, there's reality in terms of what you may see and may do, and then there's perception about who gets put out there, and then there's the question of where do the stings happen when they're concentrated stings in what city. I know it differs. But there are some issues, as much as we hate to talk about it probably, there are some real issues around whether it's perception or reality, questions around race and ethnicity and gender and class dynamics, even though we know it affects all of us, that I think we need to unpack and deal with a little bit more. I mean, and that has real implications right on the street,
Well,
and how people are perceived and
As far as
valued.
the prostitution operations that we do, when you look on Backpage, they clearly post on the ads, no black men.
Right.
No black men, because they're afraid they're gonna get robbed, they're gonna get beat. So you got even the black girls that post who say, I love white boys.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they say. That's on the ad on Backpage. So the ones that they want are the older white men who have money. Because they think they can make more tips and they can get over on them. They don't want young black guys, and if they do take black guys, because I've been to John before, I walked into the room and the girl's like, oh, I'm sorry. Because I didn't sound like, you know, the hood rat on the phone. She was like, oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
When I walked in, I was like, what? I said, let me guess, you don't do black guys. So she said, no.
Right. I mean, it's complicated, clearly, right? I mean, let's get some questions, please. It's complicated, but there's what you're seeing when you're doing enforcement. There's what we just are seeing from the brief painting of some things from in demand and who's getting put up and who's getting shamed, and what perception that has and what reach that has versus what reach now you've given us some insight. There's some real difference in terms of then what that means for certain communities and the perceptions of communities.
Well,
right? And then let's get to those who are surviving, the victims and how they are seen.
Well, I don't
right?
know where those operations were targeted and what demographic location they were. But I'm telling you right now, you could go over here on Euclid in East Cleveland. And that's the time predominantly black neighborhood. And there'll be white guys trolling up and down the street. There'll be black guys trolling up and down the street. It's not a race thing. It is whoever wants to buy sex on that particular day.
Right.
And I know that white guy doesn't live in that neighborhood. I know he's coming down there for a reason. Just like when they go down to a certain area to buy or score whatever drug of their choice that they want to use.
If anyone's familiar with Chicago, I did do a map, and it does show like where the stings are. The stings are in the poor neighborhoods, which tend to be more minority. But you can map and see exactly where in Chicago those stings are and where everyone is being arrested. And they are. I mean, you're talking about. We're talking about two different things. Backpage escorts is different from street level stings.
Well, I'm talking street level stores as well.
But you get them through Backpage.
No.
No.
No, these are just street walkers. We
Not
go
saying.
out, set up.
Yeah.
We set up decoys on the street, female police officers, and these are the guys.
And you
who
don't
show
see
up.
any disproportionate minority?
It's mostly white. From the suburbs.
Which is interesting. Let's get some questions, please. Which is interesting to me because the perception and the ways in which the media portrays who is doing what is one thing. I guess that's what I just keep coming back to. What you're seeing when you say race doesn't matter is because you're seeing it play out in the streets in different ways through the way you do enforcement. But right, in location, right.
People on the street
right.
are the same in the Chicago neighborhood versus
right.
what's going on in Cleveland.
Right.
Of course it's not going to be the same.
But that doesn't mean race doesn't play a role. That doesn't mean race or economics or ethnicity does not play a role. The role it plays and in what part of the equation is a different moment, right? And that's what the perception and the actuality, the location, the context, all of those make a difference. But to say race, for me, not detective, no. But I'm just saying in terms of perception and in terms of reality of certain neighborhoods, so it may be all white, but race is playing a role because, white people have race, right? So it may be all white in that neighborhood because of context and location and economics and all of that is playing a role. But what that means in terms of how it shapes policies and people and who is seen as villainous and who is seen as not worthy of attention and they out there doing it to themselves. All of that is I think, a part of the dynamic. That's not to say that perception and dynamic is always panning itself out. That's why we're having this conversation, to get more information. But we got to be aware of that and what that means in terms of how we move, especially if we want the grassroots activity. We got questions? Questions?
I did have a question. Craig Bourne. With each of the panelists, some questions came to my mind in terms of what is being done to quantify, to measure, and to compare the effectiveness of various approaches. Ms. Jones, not to pick on you or to challenge the effectiveness of your program, but when one looks, for instance, because you had made the comment that you couldn't really measure this or haven't really measured this. And that may not be the case. I might have gained a false impression. But when one looks, for instance, at 12-step programs, among the very few clinical studies of their effectiveness are 3 that I can recall out of Harvard Medical School that show when you back out spontaneous recovery according to well-studied percentages, the programs are either 12-step programs are either totally ineffective or they're actually reducing the rate from what it would be for spontaneous recovery. So, I'm wanting to see what's being done to quantify the effectiveness of approaches and to compare those to other alternative approaches. And not just with you, but with each of the panelists.
That's the thing. It's a lot of things that we're doing, we test it out to see if it's effective. You're not going to find a whole bunch of, you can consider someone, I consider someone a success that sticks with the program, who comes on a regular basis. Whether I can guarantee you, whether they'll ever go back out, I can't guarantee you. That could happen. They're at risk of it. That's why I said they need a lifetime. Just like AA, even though people have been recovered for years, they still go to those meetings. Those meetings are what keep them in their minds. They feel like if I stick with this, it's effective, and it's just support. It's a support.
Studies of the effectiveness of AA, the Harvard Medical School researchers pointed out that when people do take this AA approach, they tend to use circularity in defining the effectiveness of the program in terms of we're following an AA approach, therefore we have an effective program. In other words, people show up for meetings, therefore the program is effective.
Well,
Did you want to respond to that, Renee?
yeah. I think that where we are, we're still learning so much about what is effective, what works, what doesn't work. And I don't think you're going to find anybody that can tell you right now they got 100% of anything. Because we're still learning. Every time you learn something new, they come up with something different. You're dealing with sometimes years of people who've been manipulated for years, and there has not been any help. We get people from all over. I think we have people that come from Canton, because there's no help. So when they find anything, whether it's a support group, they're just happy to engage in it. And we know the effectiveness of support. Support is whatever you're going through, whether it's alcohol, drugs, sex, or whatever. If you have constant support, your chances of being successful are greater than not having it. But as far as like numbers saying, we can guarantee you 10, I can't guarantee you nothing. When the people come in, I'm happy every day when I see the same people who are consistent, who know they used to be isolated, now they're doing things. You're seeing them like a Rachel, for example, somebody that, she comes from a long way. She doesn't even live in Cleveland. She comes from a long way because she is determined to get what she needs. So that's where we are with it, and we're still learning. It's a very complicated issue. It's not cookie cutter. You can't do the same thing for everyone. We don't do the same thing for everyone. That's why ours is different. I'll create something new that ain't been done for nobody if it's gonna help that person. So you have to tailor it to fit the needs of the individual. That's how complex this is. So every person that is in our program, I can tell you the majority of them, we don't do the same thing for each one. Some things work the same for everyone. The one thing that works good for everybody is support. Across the board, that consistent support group, that's powerful. But the other things are very tailored to the individual's needs. And like this parent thing, working with these kids, this is something new. It came out of an issue, a cry of parents coming, knowing that they don't want to see their girls and daughters trafficked. So what kind of help can we give them? Now this is something new. We didn't know what to do. I'm like, well, you know what? Let's put them in a group with people that's been trafficked. And let these people kind of share with them, and let's embrace them, let's hear them, and we don't judge them. Like, I'm very clear about any help that comes there, because at this point, we're total volunteer operation. We're getting ready to hire our first employee on Monday. Thank God. I'm so glad. But I am very particular. I don't just put people in things, because you can't come in and do this kind of work and have preconceived judgments, be judgmental. You're going to have to be very forgiving. People are going to fall down. They're going to make mistakes. You can't write them off. You just got to keep lifting them up, and hopefully that they will catch on. That's all we can do at this point.
I think we have a couple more.
Sister Cecilia, I would like to go back to that issue of the stings and the demographic and law enforcement. And I think it makes a difference, for instance, if the sting is occurring, for instance, through the FBI task force or it's something at county level. I work with the police, the local police district where I live, and they have allowed me now to become an advocate. I go out with them when they're doing an undercover sting. This is very local. It's the municipal police district there. And one of the things that I've noticed is that it does make a difference if it's a local sting where that locale is, so who's the population there and who might be coming in, okay? So I think the level at which the sting is carried out makes a difference in that demographic picture. The other thing, I want to go back to something John said in terms of the education and awareness level of local police districts and local law enforcement. I thought it was pretty significant that a local police district would let me come first, and it was an allow me to do this after they kind of vetted my motivation, what else I was doing, who I was working with, to go out with them on undercover stings. That allowing me to do it has also allowed me to collect a lot of informal local information, including how law enforcement reacts to, responds to, talks about, and treats the women, and it's all been women who have been arrested. So there's been a next step also that has occurred since that beginning, and that is now they are telling me that they are so glad I'm out there because I'm the only woman with those women. And they're saying things like, now, they would never talk to us. And I'm thinking, well, of course not, They're handcuffed behind their backs. They're crying. They're sweating like crazy because they've just had this huge adrenaline rush of fear. Then they drop like a rock, and they're shaking and freezing, and they're handcuffed behind their backs. And there's no other woman with them. So they're saying to me now, we're glad you're here. They'll talk to you, and they are doing that now. So it puts in more pieces from the personal level of individual human beings. And I'll tell you, that's what I'm all about. I am about those individual human beings, their value, their worth, their need for some kind of recognition at that very moment when they're probably feeling the least human that they can possibly be feeling. Because not only were they engaged, either willingly or not willingly, in the purchasing of their bodies for sex, but now they've been arrested for it. There's not much lower that it can go at that particular moment. So I want to say a word, too, of encouragement and gratitude to all the law enforcement persons who really are welcoming now perhaps various kinds of advocacy at very critical moments. I just wanted to say that because John works at a higher level of it. I work very locally. I'll tell you now, too, what I'm seeing. The area where I live is the police district in the greater Cleveland area where the highest incidents of heroin selling and buying are going on. In my neighborhood, we have people coming in from Eastlake, Chardon, Solon. I'm telling you just the ones that are arrested for coming in to buy heroin. And it's because of I-90 and the easy entrance exits off of I-90 particular to that area. This is also having an impact on whatever we call the commercial sex trade, trafficking. The presence of an advocate kind of slows the process down just enough to be able to ask some deeper questions that might lead local law enforcement to realizing these women are not out there because that's what they just decided to do tonight. It was a fun thing to do, you know, but they actually may be being trafficked. And it takes a little bit of time and a little bit of a deeper questioning to be able to surface that kind of information. Thank you.
I think Terry and then Manu.
I just wanted to just address what you said, and I'm sorry. Okay, I just wanted to address what this gentleman said. I'm by no means, I have a science background, so it's a little bit different probably from the social sciences, but I think from what my understanding of hard sciences is that it's very easy to study a system that's closed. It's very easy to study a disease that's purely genetically based, but when you have so many environmental factors, and not to call what the girls have gone through any type of disease, but the susceptibility to that. So I would question any study that comes to any easy certitude about the effectiveness of, you know, one line of approach to healing in any way. And I would say that the real issue here, we should not be looking at this through the lens of just numbers and statistics, but how ethically, with our hearts, what we're supposed to do. I mean, it's of no, how can I prove to you that supporting somebody, except through observation, supporting them and empowering them has a positive effect on them? I don't know what it will exactly lead to, because human beings, quite frankly, that's the beauty of being humans, that we have choice. And sometimes we make bad choices and good choices, and our life has a certain level of agency, maybe not complete freedom, but certainly agency.
Well, by looking at measures of effective agency following treatment as opposed to before, for instance. By looking at developing and looking at some measures of such agency before and after the intervention that you're talking about, and then measuring the effectiveness along those lines of the outcome. Well,
well, actually, this is an interesting question, because maybe the question of what we mean by success may be an issue. Now, one of the normal ways we think, and this is the way I used to think, that success for a program, say in addiction or alcoholism or prostitution, is that you have some intervention, and at some point that person is able to sustain that free life on their own without support. And that's the measure of success, if they can. But I'm wondering whether that's always the case for all conditions. There may be some, for one thing, none of us are really autonomous agents. We all depend on a support network of some kind to succeed in life. I mean, it may not be an institution, but it's family, it's, you know, colleagues, it's work, all kinds of things. So maybe the measurement of success should not necessarily be, can this person break free from the support network and exist on their own? But the measurement of success is, if, say, Renee's program has some person off the streets for 10, 15 years, we have 10, 15, or 15 years of 15 person years that has been saved. And it may never be independent. And there may be a situation where the person that if you withdraw that support network, they fail. But that may not be a failure of the program. It may be just the fact of the nature of the problem we're dealing with. And the success rate should be measured in terms of person years of the program, not whether they can do it without the support.
But the fact remains that one can develop criteria for meeting.
Yeah, but a couple things. One, what she's doing is not AA. So like using that as a model to say, and the other one, there is a lot of support for peer interventions in general, mental health and peer support as part of interventions. There is evidence for it.
So who now has the mic? Who now has the mic? Dr. Rondi gonna step in as the moderator facilitator with Brian Grand. We're gonna go to the person who has the mic. We're coming up on 12:30. We'll stay here a little longer if you all want to stay here, but we know our panelists also have things to do, and I know Renee and Rachel have to go back to a group that they're having, and I would like them to have some final words, and I would like all of our panelists to give us what's next, the grassroots piece. What can we do? Okay.
Thank you. I'm a student at MSAS as well, and I work in NERC, the Northeast Reintegration Center, with women who have substance use disorders, and we see a lot of this come through our doors, and I'm scared for them the minute they walk out of the prison because of this situation. But I actually wanted to take us in a slightly different direction because I'm wondering about the traffickers themselves and where they come from and how they develop, and is there a place that we can cut off that line so that we don't have so many people becoming traffickers, and is that another avenue for change that we can focus on as well?
Yeah, some of these traffickers are taught by their fathers, their brothers, and this is a family lifestyle. Some of them are brought into this game by the girls themselves, the escorts who learn under another pimp or trafficker. When he's gotten arrested, she has a void to fill. She finds someone else to run her and teach them the game. And then this guy becomes, I've had a case just like that. And some of them are drug dealers, and some of them are gun runners, and some of them have just chose to branch off into something else because, look, I can go to prison for a whole lot of years and I lose a whole lot of money when my shipments don't come in from over here, but here I have a resource. I didn't have to really put much into her. I didn't take her from someone. She's an addict off the street, or she has extremely low self-esteem. I've now manipulated her. I've gotten two now. All I have to do is pay for room and board, which could be at a Motel 6 is $39 a night, and feed them once a day, give them some clothes, get their nails done every once in a while, and they're making me $2,000 a day. And, you know, the terms that they use are throwaways, you know. That's a pimp term, throwaway girl, just throwaway. Because if you have someone that's underage, and just think about this, if you have someone that's underage that you may have taken from another state or picked up on the street and you guys are now in another city, every time you send her out on a date or drop her off at somebody's house, this person, if they know that she's underage, can do anything they want to this girl. Because do you think the pimp's gonna say, hey, 911, what's your emergency? Well, I kidnapped this girl, she's been working for me, I'd send her on a date to this house and she never came back. You think he's gonna do that? He's just gonna go out and he's gonna find somebody else. So, to answer your question is, they come from all over. They're taught, some of them are self-taught, some have branched out from their other business ventures, from narcotic distribution, gun running, to this, and then some are just brought up that way. If you are raising a child around this, what do you think that child's gonna know? Oh, I see daddy beating this girl, I see daddy doing this. I see this is how daddy runs things. That's how he grows up.
Last question? You had to compete with whatever it is.
So what can we do? I know that's been a big question for people. If we could get our panelists to say, from the grassroots, what can we do?
Yeah. I think what people can do, one of the things that we like to do in addition to working with the survivors and victims is to make sure, educate people, just like we're talking about it here, making it real, bringing it to your neighborhood, you sharing the message with people you know, you talking to people in your community, because today you've heard from a lot of different views about prosecuting, what all the challenges, but it's everybody, none of us can do it alone. We need everybody to play a role. We need people, like I always see, I remember the case where the woman, Perlina Richardson.
Oh, you can say her name.
Yeah, okay, she's prosecuted. I can talk
She's
about
in
her.
prison. So
Okay,
we can tell her.
yeah, that was a woman trafficker. And here she had picked up the runaway. She was 16, I believe. And then she had picked up another girl who was like 21, I believe. That's the one we ended up with. But, you know, here she was, a female, and trafficking had this girl. All you need is a camera, and your phone can really do it. You take the picture and upload it and put them on Backpage and start selling them. But, you know, people, and when she was busted, I remember people being interviewed on the news saying, "What? I seen all those cars coming in there, but I didn't know what was happening." I mean, it had just a real little bungalow house, you know, a big Maserati. I mean, expensive cars pulling up in her driveway. You didn't pay attention to that. So I always tell parents, ain't nobody having that much company in the world, and especially not with those type of vehicles. So those are red flags. There are red flags as us as a community member should notice. You know, I always think about the Gina, they hate, even though they weren't really trafficking.
Bring that up.
But it's like, as soon as I seen that, I'm like, what's wrong with people? I'm saying, ain't nobody said windows all boarded up. I mean, I seen a gazillion red flags. You see, but nobody, you know why? Because people don't want to get involved. They don't, but if we can get involved as a community, when you see something, say something. Question it. You know, where have you seen that? Why is a lot of young girls running out? Like where we're located, we have apartments. And I have, it's a small apartment above the center. I heard the man living up there, I said, you got a lot of young girls coming in here. You know what we do? Because I be questioning that. I did. I was like, where are these girls coming? Who are these girls? You know, and I ain't seen no more. Because I was like, I need to know why you got all these young girls coming to your place. I need to know that.
Yeah, you don't see these houses popping up in the likes of Shaker Heights and Rocky River and Beechwood or whatever, because everybody knows their relatives. Everybody knows everybody, and they question things.
Yes.
They question things, and they don't hesitate to call the police.
Yes.
If you go, like, you know, you just used the man and Gina,
Yes.
you know, those people in that area walk around like this because they don't want to be targeted by the drug dealers if they snitch, or, you know, this is how they walk through. They don't see anything but what's right in front of them.
Right in front of them.
So when we have people who actually know when you have parents that know your kids' friends' names, not Doodoo Bug, not whatever nickname you know on the street, you know him as Michael Johnson, you know him as, and you know his family, this stuff can't go on. Because, well, I've seen it, I don't know how many times. I mean, well, who's this guy? You know, well, I only know him as you know, some nickname. You know, and I'm like, okay, so how are we supposed to help you if all you got is a nickname? You've been with this guy for, and obviously she doesn't want to tell you his name. I mean, these are the things that you have to work through. But again, if it starts at home, in my opinion.
Yes, it does.
And for those who don't have that home life, you know, social services are desperately failing these individuals and their individual support system, as you just talked about, because a lot of people that are coming up that don't have the family, as they quote unquote normal people have, they also have maybe the extended family support. But when they don't have that, you know, I've had a girl who her home life was messed up. We popped her pimp. She got out. As soon as the pimp went to prison, she sought out another guy. She was with another pimp in Canton. They arrested him in Canton. She testified against that guy. She got 2 pimps sent to prison. She ends up she's addicted to drugs. She goes to Marysville. She gets out of Marysville. She starts back on the dope again, starts right back into the game. And we tried to give her every bit of support through Belfair, through Renee, trying to get her GED, the whole thing. If they don't want it, they're not going to have it. But it all started at home. Her mother was a stripper. her mother was addicted to dope, and that's what she saw. And how she got into the business is she started stripping at a strip bar at the age of 16. So it all starts at home.
I just wanted to bring up a question that came to us yesterday. As a citizen, people wanted to know how do they reach out and what do they do? And we told them that today would be the day to ask that question because, you know, I know there's numbers for the coalition and the hotline and tips like that, but it's not readily out there. And they were also questioning that they didn't want to risk. How would they know to not risk someone who is their agency to do it, or if they're undocumented person in the U.S.? So they brought up all of these questions on who would they reach out to call if they thought that someone was being trafficked, but they weren't sure what the next step would be to do.
Well, you can do it a number of ways. You know, you can go through a non-government organization if you feel that, if that person may feel that they want to talk to someone before contacting law enforcement, they can talk to people like, you know, everybody that we've mentioned here today, the different agencies, Renee and Belfair. They can call places. Any victim advocate. There's victim advocates at the prosecutor's office, at the FBI, at a whole bunch of social service agencies that have victim advocates. They can contact them before they contact law enforcement, or they can contact law enforcement. If they're going to tell on someone, they could be anonymous.
And the signs to look for that you usually talk about that.
Yeah, and you know, I always tell people, because it varies all over the place. Like we have the standard list, but I always tell parents, you know, if you've had an outgoing kid and all of a sudden you notice they're very isolated, they're withdrawn from a lot of people, because we see that a lot. And then they start doing bad in school. You just notice a whole change in their behavior. They're very withdrawn. They don't want to talk to you. Sometimes they come with gifts that you know you haven't purchased. Kind of depends on the home. So I always tell people to pay attention. Like John said, you need to know who their friends are. You start seeing them hanging around somebody different that you don't know who they are. Because I'm always amazed that these girls who've been trafficked for a long time, and they really don't know the guy's name. They'll be like, his name is Blue, Ice Blue. He'll have like a street name. And I mean, they literally don't know what his real name is. You know, and that's all they know him by. So pay attention, you know, being aware of who, you know, who's in your neighborhood. Like you said, people, you seeing people strange, you seeing them in and out. Like I'll see stuff all, like me noticing him having girls going up there. Where's these girls? Ask the question. You know, and if you don't feel confident like that, see, I ain't got no problem. I'll be like, what they doing right there? You know, I do. I don't care. I'm like, because you're going to save their life. Call the hotline. They got it's anonymous ways to do it. But for us to do nothing, it's not. It's everybody's responsibility, because that could be someone that you know. Because a lot of times people don't care because it hasn't touched their door. But let me tell you, I done seen people from everywhere, parents of all backgrounds. It doesn't discriminate. I don't care what your profession is. Your kid, your niece, somebody you love could be a victim to this.
The question last night was, what do you do with, say, a migrant worker or someone that's not from a child, like that's been trafficked within the country from another country? What do you think, if I call the hotline and they're an illegal immigrant, what would the Justice Department do?
They are not going to be deported. Right. Okay. They are granted a temporary visa.
Even if trafficked. Yeah, even if it turns out they're not being trafficked. Because I know if they are being trafficked, they get a visa. But if it turns out you were wrong, are you now responsible for them? Yeah.
Right. I see what you're saying, and I don't have the answer to that question.
Yeah. And that's a part that I'm sure that, you know, that's an area that we haven't really tapped into, but we're going to. Because, you know, if you feel like you're going to be deported, like I think they have the ICE agency, that works on, but people are not going to go to know the age because it would like if it's not determined that there are it is a trafficking case, they could be deported. I mean, you can't really guarantee that. So I just think that people should, you have enough non-governmental agencies to at least ask the questions, to get some direction, to see if, we've been working with it long enough to say, hey, that looks like this. You need to talk to somebody. That's where working together comes in, and you can say, I think this might be a case. It's safe to talk to this person. But people have to trust you. This is a work of trust. We don't get people just because they're, somebody just says it. No, they have to, a lot of what's happening at our center is because of trust of what is happening for them, that they'll tell somebody it's okay, because they're not going to do that.
But also on that, just because there may not be a federal nexus or there may not be a trafficking issue, you have a whole lot of other state charges that can be looked at as well. Rape, felonious assault, whatever. So they're going to be victims in some way, shape, or form. It may just not be trafficking. That's the great thing about me being both a state and then a federal. Because if I don't have something that gives me the nexus to go federal, I can charge rape, I can charge kidnapping, I can charge all these different state codes that I can't charge federally, which actually may even give them more time than they would under the federal statute. And then with the new state statute, which has been out for about a year, it's supposed to be, House Bill 130 is going to be changing it pretty soon. It's the trafficking in persons at the state 2905.32 Ohio Revised Code, which makes it a mandatory 10 to 15 years for people if we can prove that there's been forced fraud or coercion. But under House Bill 130, which I'm going to speak on, I think, Tuesday, that adds an age in there. So we're looking to put anybody under the age of 17, we don't have to prove, very similar to the federal charge, we don't have to prove forced fraud or coercion. It's a mandatory 10 to 15 year sentence.
I wanted to answer your question. I've been off the street for 15 years, but I was working with an organization, and just as long as I stayed clean, I was doing good. They wasn't helping me in my trauma or when I was being trafficked or nothing like that until I found Renee. And I told them that something isn't right, I still don't feel right. So I searched out and I found Renee. You can't put a time limit on this because everybody's different, because you have to deal with trauma, your self-esteem issues and all that. So you can't say to one person, oh, it's going to take you a couple of years to get healthy. That's why this is, I can't even answer, because I've been off the street since 15 years, and I'm still, sometimes I go crazy now. But sometimes things aren't right with my trauma, and I can't even say. It's just that I still have to keep coming to Renee. I never miss a Saturday with her, because I know I take my recovery, and I take my recovery in human trafficking very seriously. So
if you have to do it for all your life, that's still a success.
I will still do it all my life.
That's still a success.
Yes.
Even if you need, the fact that you needed it all your life is not a failure. It's a
right.
Or you fail. We all have permanent support systems in our lives.
Right.
That's what keeps us going. And it's
Right.
permanent. It has to be there. If Sunday I lost my family and my friends and my work, who knows what kind of person I'll be.
Right.
Okay.
But this is not a 12-step or a AA program.
And I wasn't meaning to suggest
Okay,
that.
okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I think our speakers need to go. You wanted to ask a quick question?
Just one question. From a law enforcement point of view, wouldn't it make more sense to go after, like we were talking about supply and demand? Wouldn't it make more sense to raise the bar for the Johns, so to speak? You know, like if you did make it a felony, wouldn't that be more than a slap on the wrist for that person, the professional or non that's out there tricking? What I'm saying, if the men, whether they were, just like how they did the thing with the war on drugs, they started going after the buyers.
Sure.
After they saw that when they take down one drug dealer, here's several more. Okay, well, if you start imprisoning people that you know, if you out there trying to look for a transsexual, you have a deviant, if you're a man, you got a deviant sexual behavior in the first place, especially if you're married.
Well, that's debatable. Well, go ahead.
No, wait a minute. I mean,
We don't want to get to the
no. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about from a moral point,
Oh, okay.
not a lifestyle choice.
Okay. And let's be clear that it is a moral framework. This is the Social Justice Institute and the Moore International Center for Ethics and Excellence. So that's why y'all see me jumping on these points. But go ahead.
Well,
I just want to be clear that
what
not
I'm saying,
everybody
be
thinks
true
that's
to
deep.
whatever lifestyle choices you make.
That I like that. Lifestyle choices.
You know, but if I'm married and I want to go out, no, I'm just saying it's my own opinion. If I'm married and I want to go out and mess with little boys, I don't think that's good. But see, those are the people that's out there buying this. So if you get the people that are soliciting sex, period, especially if to commercialize sex is illegal, if you get the buyer, the seller wouldn't have any business.
It's like child porn. They really go after them.
In Sweden, and it's not been fully successful. I've read those studies.
Well, whether you're married or not, you're going after little boys as a depending on your age, it's problematic. But can we have if there's an answer to the question, I see what you're saying.
Go after child porn detector, right? Go after the hard video.
That would stop people, or at least make it.
Well, here's the thing. Child porn obviously is illegal. The penalties are severe. I mean, you're talking starting at 15 years for manufacturing or even having a picture in whatever system you want to be charged in. Still doesn't stop people from doing it.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah, there are, drugs is illegal.
Right.
But you still have you got low-level dealers, you got some of the rich people that are dealing drugs.
Right.
Doesn't stop them.
Okay.
Do I think it would help curb it?
That's all
It will help curb it a little bit,
Okay.
but it's still going to happen.
Okay.
If that's the case, we have laws in this country. Everybody knows the laws. Doesn't stop them from breaking them.
Okay.
So basically, we just putting a bandage on him.
Well, I mean, we don't truly know what the answer is.
Okay.
I mean, people know if you do drugs, you can get in trouble. If you sell drugs, you can get in trouble. How many people do we have in our prison system who are selling and peddling whatever drug of choice they choose? It's still going to happen. Penalties are crazy for child porn. Just for downloading off the internet one image can get you 15 years. Does that stop people from doing it? No, it just makes them a little more careful. And all it's just going to do is it's going to drive this underground even more. People are still going to be buying and purchasing. I mean, this is, as people always like to quote, it's the oldest profession in the book. I don't necessarily believe that, but it's been going on for a long time. It's not going to stop. It's just going to go deeper and deeper underground. The internet already in itself is hiding a lot of things. People, the stuff that you used to see on the street, if you remember going up and down Euclid, there used to just be whatever. Now, all those tracks, those street tracks have now dwindled down to specific little areas because everything's on the internet now. And you can have so much anonymity on the internet. I can be Paul to this girl whose name is Lexi. I know that's not her name, and I know my name isn't Paul. So I can go and I can have sex with Lexi, and she thinks my name is Paul. And all I did was buy a track phone. I'm not using anything that has to do with my cellular telephone number. I can go to Drug Mart and buy a track phone, put minutes on it, call her up, set up a date, have sex with her, and nobody knows it's me, except me.
Thank you very much for coming. I can tell you have a lot of questions.